Over to you, Akila.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's incredible session. My name is Akila Watkins, and I'm President and CEO of Independent Sector. We are a national membership organization where we unite nonprofits and philanthropy to strengthen the charitable sector, identifying structural challenges, and mobilizing the sector around policy and practice solutions. And if you're not a member of Independent Sector and are interested in learning more, please visit our website to learn more about how to become a member. Independent Sector is thrilled to continue our long-standing partnership and co-host the annual Symposium on Public Policy for Nonprofits with the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action, ARNOVA, and Nonprofit Policy Forum. ARNOVA is a diverse community of scholars, educators, and practice leaders who work to strengthen the field of charity, nonprofit, and philanthropic research to improve society and human life. Nonprofit Policy Forum is an open access academic journal that publishes original research and analysis on public policy issues and the public policy process critical to the work of nonprofit organizations like yourselves. This symposium is designed to explore key questions and issues related to public policy affecting nonprofits and philanthropy. We'll also consider what additional research is needed to create better policies to strengthen nonprofits and philanthropy to ensure all people thrive. This event is centered on building bridges between the academic and practitioner communities to inform and improve our collective work. Today's speakers include researchers and practitioners exploring the intersections of measuring and communicating nonprofit and philanthropic impact on public policy and advocacy. The theme of this year's symposium is Breaking Through the Noise, Assessing and Communicating the Impact of Nonprofits and Philanthropy. We are in a unique and unprecedented time, marked by shrinking government support for the charitable sector, growing demand for services, and the need for the public to better understand the role of nonprofits and philanthropy in their community. For example, Independent Sector's 2023 Trusted Nonprofits and Philanthropy Report found that the nonprofit sector is almost completely identified with charities in the mind of the public. Its role is seen as providing aid and support to those in need. According to that same report, the public's expectation of nonprofit impact are high and increasing. 8 in 10 Americans want to see proof of impact in exchange for continued support. Now, more than ever, we must effectively communicate the depth and breadth of the charitable sector and demonstrate how it touches the lives of average Americans. Nonprofits are major employers, but our workforce is suffering due to funding retrenchment, which will lead to downstream effects like job losses and less buying power for nonprofit employees. When the public, the media, and the lawmakers that serve us understand the benefits we provide, we can break through the political partisanship and build powerful coalitions of support, even during polarized times like the ones we find ourselves in. Research like that presented today is key to helping this message break through. The trusted experts who will share their findings today are here to help you become better informed advocates for your organization. They are here to share strategies to assess and effectively communicate impact you can use to persuade your communities, media partners, and representatives to support your organization through the hard times ahead. Let me say, on behalf of Independent Sector, I want to extend my sincere thanks to the team at ARNOVA and Nonprofit Policy Forum. This event is a year-long undertaking, and it wouldn't be possible without your hard work and dedication. We're stronger with you than without you, and so is the sector. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Chow Go, Chair of the Board of Directors at ARNOVA, to tell us about how our partnerships strengthen the nonprofit sector through events like this symposium and other joint ventures. Dr. Chow.
Thank you, Dr. Watkins. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such an honor to be here and be with you all. My name is Chao Guo. I am a professor of nonprofit management and the current president of ARNOVA. And for those who was not familiar with ARNOVA was founded in 1971. It is the oldest and the largest international and interdisciplinary association of nonprofit researchers. Before I continue with my remarks, I would like to ask, if you haven't done so already, to take a moment and complete the poll to tell us which organization you are from. I believe you already got the poll. I hope you already submitted the poll, your entry. This year marks the 14th anniversary of the Policy Symposium. And ARNOVA is thrilled to continue our long-standing partnership with independent sector and the Nonprofit Policy Forum. I still have the fond memory of my first close encounter with the symposium. It was 10 years ago in 2015. I had the honor of serving as the symposium planning co-chair, along with Dennis Young, the founding editor of the Nonprofit Policy Forum. And Alan Abramson was the president of ARNOVA back then. It was such a wonderful experience and learning opportunity for me. Over the years, we have strengthened our partnership with independent sector, the largest and most influential infrastructure organization and the leading voice for the nonprofit sector. And with the Nonprofit Policy Forum, one of the best scholarly journals in the nonprofit field, and the only with a strong focus on public policy for nonprofits. Among the three partners, we complement each other's work so well. Together, we make a great team and we have synergy. Our chemistry is strong. More importantly, our partnership enables us to accomplish our collective goals of better serving our members, our stakeholders, and the sector at large. So why the symposium, and why is it important to build bridges between academics and practitioners? I think this understanding and appreciation of the great, amazing practice work from the sector is the source of our motivation for all three organizations. When ARNOVA was founded in 1971, they were founded by a group of scholars who were they were pioneers, and they were so inspired and fascinated by the amazing work by the nonprofit voluntary action in the United States and across the world. And when independent sector was founded in 1980, it quickly became the leading voice for the sector because we needed a representative. We needed someone who can push the sector, move the sector forward. And when the journal was founded, NPF was based on the belief that there are so many policy concerns that we have across the sector that we need good research to help inform practice. And that's how we started. And just as Akila mentioned, this event is designed to share knowledge and build bridges between academics that study the sector and practitioners that work to carry out the nonprofit missions. So we are in this together, especially in this challenging times. Oh, by the way, I'm seeing the results of the poll now. We have 60% of our audience from from the nonprofit organization, and 11% from philanthropy, 19% from higher education, another 10% from students of higher education, and many from the consulting sector as well. And we do have 2% from the government sector as well. As you can see, it represents the diversity of the sector and its partners and stakeholders, and it really represents well the reason why we're having this symposium. So in closing, I want to say a big thank you to our partners, independent sector, Dr. Keela Watkins, and your wonderful team. I want to thank Dr. Alan Abramson, Marie Kim, and Stephen Topler, co-editors of NPF. I also want to thank all the panelists, the scholars, and my practice leaders who are sharing their expertise with us today. And not but not the least, thank you all for taking your time to attending this wonderful event. I look forward to learning from you and with you today. Now I would like to introduce our MC for today, Dr. Alan Abramson, co-editor-in-chief of a Nonprofit Policy Forum.
Thank you, Chao. It's a great pleasure to work with Independent Sector and ARNOVA on this annual event. It's been a terrific collaboration, and it's a real honor to be a part of this. As Chao mentioned, I represent, I'm on the faculty at George Mason University and one of the co-editors of Nonprofit Policy Forum, along with my colleagues Marie Kim and Stefan Topler, and represent Nonprofit Policy Forum on the welcoming team today. As Akila mentioned, NPF publishes papers on nonprofit policy issues, like regulation of nonprofits or tax changes affecting charitable giving. The journal is open access, meaning you don't have to pay to read the journal. Papers submitted to the journal are peer-reviewed before they're accepted for publication, which gives a stamp of legitimacy for both authors and readers. And we publish papers in a number of different formats, research articles, policy briefs, commentaries, and others. Please check out the journal online or be in touch with me or one of the other co-editors with any questions. Especially relevant for this meeting is that we publish a special issue every year with papers from the Policy Symposium. So as MC, I'm not Monty Hall and Let's Make a Deal, but I am your MC for today. And thank you for spending your Friday afternoon with us. As we start, we'd like to take a moment to ask you and to run a poll about what you're hoping to take away from today's event. And you should see that poll on your screen now. I also want to share a few logistical notes. Today's event is being recorded. Closed captioning is enabled. And American Sign Language interpretation is also available. For the ASL interpretation, we'd ask that you pinned Danita Odie's video on your screen. If you run into any issues, please email Christopher W@independencesector.org. We're going to have 3 exciting panels today, all addressing topics at the intersection of policy, communications, and impact, assessing impact. Each panel will be facilitated by an expert and will include paper presentations and a discussion among presenters. The 10 papers that we're featuring today were chosen from among 50 proposals that were submitted earlier this year. We had 4 outside experts, including both scholars and practitioners, review the 50 proposals, and their reviews guided the final selections by the Symposium Planning Committee. During today's presentations, we encourage you to submit questions for the presenters in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If your question isn't answered, We'll do our best to address it in our follow-up email. Note that with a group this size, and we had, I think, over 800 people signed up, the chat feature is not enabled for this webinar. So again, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions. At the end of the event, we hope you'll respond to a brief survey about what we can do to improve future symposia. Our first panel will focus on communicating nonprofit impact through data and storytelling. Our second panel will focus on advancing nonprofit impact through policy advocacy and civic engagement. After our second panel, we'll have a short 10-minute break, but we hope you'll stick around. You'll want to, because our last panel focuses on an interesting topic on elevating impact in restrictive political climates. And it looks like the poll results are in. I'd say all three of the options we gave you look like were important, and we do hope to we do hope that your hopes will be met during today's workshop. Understanding how others are thinking about the issues, give you some of the latest research and insights, and some practical strategies to implement in your organization. So with that, let's turn to the first panel. And I'm pleased to introduce the moderator. Kara Young-Ponder is the Vice President of Knowledge, Impact, and Strategy for the National Council of Nonprofits, which I should say is a really another critical infrastructure organization for the sector that has, as I recall, over 20,000 nonprofit members, and helps to represent them both in states and nationally. So we're really thrilled to have Kara join us today. Prior to joining the National Council, Kara was the Director of Community Engagement and Racial Justice for the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative at the University of California, San Francisco. Kara, welcome, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Alan. I am thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Hello, everyone. As Alan said, my name is Kara Young-Ponder, and I am the Vice President of Knowledge, Impact, and Strategy for the National Council of Nonprofits, or NCN. At NCN, we champion, inform, and connect organizations across the country to protect and advance the sector, to support nonprofit organizations in maintaining and expanding our essential work that you do every day in all of our communities. We're proud to be the largest network of nonprofit organizations in North America. Our closest, most essential partners in this work are our network of state associations of nonprofit organizations. And if you're not yet familiar or a member of your state association of nonprofits, please join them. You can find a list of them on our website, councilofnonprofits.org, or you can reach out to us and we can get you connected. Through joining your state association of nonprofits, you also become a member of the National Council of Nonprofits. And together, this is how you can receive the most up-to-date information on what's happening in DC, how that impacts what's happening in your state, and how you can prepare and get involved in the work to protect and advance the sector. I am pleased to be serving as moderator for the first panel of this symposium. Thank you again to Independent Sector, ARNOVA, and Nonprofit Policy Forum for the invitation. The 4 papers in this panel will answer the question, how do you communicate nonprofit impact through data and storytelling in ways that break through the noise and help policymakers understand the incredible impact that nonprofit organizations are doing every day in every community? So over the next 40 minutes, you will hear 4 presentations on this theme. And once we have heard from all of our presenters, we will have 20 minutes of questions from you. If you have a question you'd like to ask, I invite you to write it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many of them as we can. First, I would like to welcome to the virtual stage Amanda Olberg and Julie De Janeiro to present their paper, A Better Metric for Measuring and Communicating Nonprofit Impact. Amanda Olberg is a Senior Portfolio Director for the Connecticut Opportunity Project, or CTOP, at Dalio Education, where she works collaboratively with grantee partner organizations to help improve their organizational capacity and performance management practices so that they can positively impact young people who are severely off track or disconnected from school and work. Julie De Janeiro is the Associate Executive Director of Domus Kids, overseeing all programs and ensuring fidelity to each program model and the Domus relational model, which helps the organization achieve excellent outcomes for youth. Amanda and Julie, I pass it to you.
Thank you very much, Kara, and hello, everyone. It's great to have this time with you today. As Kara mentioned, we are focused at Dalio Education on improving outcomes for young people and a specific population of young people, those between the ages of 14 and 26 who are experiencing disconnection from school and work or who are at risk of it. And through CTOP, we help to strengthen nonprofit organizations, working alongside our partners in their journeys to continually improve their effectiveness. Domus Kids, which is a nonprofit in Stamford, Connecticut, is one of our incredible grantee partners. And Julie and I are excited to bring to you today one of our big areas of learning from our years of working together. And that's the use of a metric that we call the active program slot, which we think has a lot to offer the sector. So today, first, I'll explain what the active program slot metric is, why we think it's a better metric than others out there, and then Julie will dive into the application of it at her organization. So if you'd go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk next. Oops, apologies, next slide from this. Thank you. So next, I'm going to talk about why we think you should use the active program slot metric. And here on the right-hand side of the slide, there's a mountain, and all the way at the very top is this flag that says long-term outcome. And that's what it's all about, right? Or at least it should be for a nonprofit organization, that the people they serve eventually climb to the very top of the mountain and grab some long-term outcome flag in their hands, some socially meaningful, measurable change that the organization has helped to create. And to make that more concrete, for most of our grantee partners, their goal is to reconnect all the young people they serve to education or work. And then here at the bottom of the mountain, in yellow, is a program staff member standing next to a young person. And they're all the way at the beginning of the journey. Most of our partners work with young people for not months, but years to help them attain their long-term outcomes. And that's because of the complexity and extent of the barriers that their young people face. So when they first start this journey, the final destination is far away. And the question is, how can our partners know week after week and month after month that they're making progress along the path that'll start winding its way up the mountain? What we have seen that a nonprofit can measure and manage is what they're putting in, the kinds of services being delivered, the levels at which those services are being delivered, and how that all matches up to a specific target population of individuals for whose benefit those services are specifically designed. And if all those things are articulated in the context of an evidence-informed program model, then you have a really good reason to be confident about the way the work is progressing. That's what the active program slot metric is designed to capture. The two pieces of first, a specific target population definition, and second, the kinds and levels of services. Could you please switch to the next slide? And I'm going to take just one more minute to try to convince you that the active program slot is more helpful than standard practice. And that's in comparison to one of the most widely used metrics in the social services sector, which is the number of people served. So let's say an organization served 4 people last year. Here they are up on the screen. We have everything from someone who attended an information session but never showed up again, all the way to someone who met weekly with a case manager. And when someone asks the organization how many people they served last year, let's say on a grant application, the organization says 4. But these 4 people got really different things, and that seems like it should really matter. The number of people served as a metric doesn't actually tell us anything meaningful about what an organization is really doing or accomplishing, and certainly nothing about whether or how much the people that they're serving are likely to benefit. And now I'll pass to Julie to share what the work at Domus has looked like.
Thank you, Amanda. Next slide, please. So Domus's mission is to build loving relationships with young people facing adversity, empowering them to pursue their path to self-sufficiency. Our school engagement program works with 400 students who are disengaged from school, which we define as having a school attendance rate of between 50 and 85% and or documented behaviors that impact their ability to succeed in school. At the beginning of 9th grade, school administrators identify students with a high likelihood of not graduating high school without a rigorous intervention. We then work with these students over 4 years to help them acquire the skills needed to graduate high school and enroll and engage in post-secondary or employment. Our model is based on the undeniable power of love to transform lives. School engagement staff called family advocates work relentlessly to engage young people, never giving up until students feel a sense of safety and belonging. For this program, the definition of active slots is 900 minutes annually of one-to-one, face-to-face engagement with their family advocate. And this actually works out to about 30 minutes a week while school is in session. Here's an example of how using the active slot metric has helped us ensure young people are receiving the support that they need to succeed. In 2023, 2 Domus family advocates went out on maternity leave, one at each of the comprehensive high schools where our family advocates are based. During this period, students were assigned to other family advocates. We saw that the number of students in active slots dropped more at one high school than at the other. We discovered that in one school, students appeared to have a stronger baseline relationship with their reassigned family advocate prior to the maternity leave. This relationship had developed organically over time because at one high school, staff members shared office space. In contrast, at the school where active slots dropped, family advocates had individual offices. Before this discovery, we believed the shared offices were a far inferior model to individual offices. But with this new information, we recognize that each design had positives and drawbacks. We worked to foster relationships with multiple family advocates at the site with individual offices, so reassigning caseloads in the future would not negatively impact student progress. Without the active slot metric, we wouldn't have uncovered the reason for the relationship disparity, and we wouldn't have been able to effectively adjust our model. Can you please move the slide? Domus has seen promising results for our school engagement students. At the end of school year 2025, 85% of our students were in active slots, and 79% of our students were promoted to the next grade level or graduated. Since January of 2024, Domus has been working with Child Trends, the leading research organization in the United States focused on improving the lives of children and families. In their analysis, Child Trends found that delivery of face-to-face services is positively associated at the 95% confidence level with student attendance at school, promotion to the next grade level, high school graduation, and the attainment of long-term outcomes a year following graduation. 60% of all youth who enrolled, not just those that graduated, achieved the long-term outcome of sustaining post-secondary education and or employment 12 months post-graduation. These outcomes are due in large part to the fact that the active slot metric gives us a real-time proxy for the long-term social value our organization creates. Next slide, please. The active slots metric provides an excellent opportunity for the sector. As a leader of an organization providing direct services to young people facing adversity, the active slot metric is invaluable. It allows us to review on a weekly basis whether young people are getting the services they need to achieve long-term outcomes. If they are not, we can rectify this immediately. For our organization, even our short and medium-term outcomes take months and years to achieve. Active slots gives us feedback in real time. Amanda, back to you.
Thank you, Julie. And I'll add that through the lens of a funder, right? CTOP is a social investment fund. We're in business to help create social value for our target population of young people. And as a funder, this metric helps us to understand what's worth investing in. It gives us a way to monitor an investment and understand the social value that that investment is likely to ultimately help create. It gives us this, and what we think of it as is a real-time proxy for the long-term social value. And we think it can be helpful to other funders in the sector in the same way. Kara, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda and Julie, for that very inspiring presentation about your work. Next up, we have Dr. Mark Hager from Arizona State University to share a paper that he wrote with Dr. Tanya Hernandez from CVANCE. And it is a paper entitled Toward a Sector-Wide Dashboard Measuring the Economic Contributions of Nonprofits in the U.S. Mark Hager is an emeritus professor of nonprofit leadership and management at Arizona State University and an associate at CVANCE Research, where he contributes expertise in research design and nonprofit sector analysis. His areas of specialization include the scope, structure, administration, financial operations, and reporting practices of nonprofit organizations. Mark?
Thank you, Kara. I like to just say I'm a research guy. I've been doing this for a long time, paying attention to both individual organizations in the nonprofit sector and the larger nonprofit sector to see what we can do in terms of advocacy, policy making, and especially better management of nonprofit organizations. I'm coming to you from my Zoom studio in Houston, Texas. I wish my colleague Tanya Hernandez could join us. She is headquartered in Mexico City, but she had some other business that took her away from us today. She really wanted to be here. She is executive director at CVANCE Research. It was her idea to present this work today, and CVANCE Research is a proud member of Independent Sector. We want to talk to you about a project we have been advocating for because it's about storytelling, and it may not look that way from the outset, but it really is. This session about storytelling, our work about storytelling, because storytelling is the only way that we can advocate, bring people to our side, and help to move the needle in any variety of ways. And I'm sure all of us have the experience of trying to convince somebody by telling them a particular story, and also have the experience of somebody saying, that sounds nice, and then moving on without really either joining or changing their approach to a particular topic. What really helps is data. Anytime that you can add data to your story, you're going to increase the viability of the story that you are telling. And there are many audiences that won't listen to a story or put much faith in a particular story unless there is data behind it. So we are data people. I'm going to talk to you about sector information that we think could help in storytelling and helping to advocate for the nonprofit sector. Where's my, okay, next slide. So sector scope information. When I talk about data, what am I talking about? We're talking about the availability of information that allows us to tell stories about our communities, our subsectors, our individual organizations, our states, our nations. And there's some examples here on the slide of the type of information that we're talking about. Talking about the number of nonprofit organizations can be persuasive to people that you're telling stories to. Sometimes not just the number of organizations, but the amount of money that's flowing through them, the resources that are flowing through them in a particular type of organization or in a particular area, be that a community, a metropolitan area, a county, a state, or even the entire United States as a whole. Not just numbers of organizations or resources, but volunteers. Numbers of volunteers might be an important number for a particular argument that you're wanting to make. And program expenditures or budgets, or the amount of money flowing through organizations, is a very typical kind of information that is used. There's other valuable kinds of information that we're going to suggest is less available to us right now, and that is stuff like employment in nonprofit organizations around the country, numbers of FTEs, something called induced spending, which is an economic impact or economic contribution kind of assessment. A nonprofit organization pays its employees. Those employees then spend money in the community. They are paying rent. They are paying their mortgages. They are going out to eat. They're buying groceries. And that induced spending has economic value in a particular community. There are also a variety of tax contributions, often not income tax and tax exempt organizations, but property tax contributions, sales tax contributions that aren't often captured, but can be useful for storytelling about the value of the nonprofit sector in our communities. Next slide. Next slide, please. Who needs sector scope information? So who needs this kind of information? Well, individual nonprofit workers, whether they're creating new organizations or are expanding programs within their organizations, often need marketing kinds of information to know what kinds of need there is in the community. And we don't know that without having this kind of data. It could be that we are creating new programs. We need an idea of what the scope of the need or the amount of resources in a particular community are, and we need to be able to tell that to people in order to attract those kinds of resources. Attract from whom? Well, a second type of audience here are funders and donors who often want to evaluate the scope of what's going on in their community to know what kind of support they want to provide. Do we want to give to arts organizations or this particular arts organization this year? Well, let's see what the scope of funding has been in the year. Where are the needs in our particular community? And we can't know that without sector data, sector scope information. A third audience here are policymakers at the federal, state, and community levels who are also trying to decide what kind of programs to develop and where to put resources for the development of their communities. And unless they have sector scope information or information about individual organizations or types of organizations, they won't know how to make resource allocation decisions. So sector scope information is very valuable. Next slide. Well, you may say, oh, well, all of this information is all readily available, isn't it? Well, some of it is. For decades, the Urban Institute has made 990 data available, and there's a link here to an effort they have to show sector brief information. I went to that recently and put in a matter of minutes, what are the largest arts organizations? How much are they funded over the last decade? And boom, I get a chart that tells me it's roughly doubled from $150 million to $300 million over the course of the last decade. I get this in minutes because I have this dashboard information available to me at the Urban Institute. What's missing here are economic contributions estimations, value added from spending by nonprofit organizations, employment information, income from labor that's being conducted in nonprofit organizations, and various tax contributions. Those kinds of things aren't readily available, but could be really valuable information for making arguments about the value of the nonprofit sector at various levels. Is that kind of thing knowable? Well, there are various bodies that have used this kind of information to produce usually advocacy-oriented reports about the value of the nonprofit sector in various places or in various subsectors. One of my favorites is the national organization Americans for the Arts, has a long-standing, now in its 6th installment, Arts and Economic Prosperity, where they're able to claim such things as $29.1 billion in tax revenues by arts organizations across the United States, or $101 billion in personal income to residents, from arts organizations. That's the kind of information you get from this kind of economic impact or economic contribution information. Here's some friends of mine at Texas A&M who've been doing Texas-wide kinds of data with this kind of information. Public charities employ a certain number of Texans through indirect and induced economic effects. Public charities spent $96 billion in 2019 through indirect and induced effects. But we only know this if we have specialists who are working on this kind of information. No, I didn't jump a slide forward. Jump a slide forward. Jump another slide forward. Jump another slide forward. I've not been given. Jump another slide forward. So this kind of info there, I now jump another slide forward. Okay, I did a bad job of telling you when to move the slide. These kinds of things are knowable. Both of those projects I just mentioned and most other economic impact valuation studies use a standard data analysis tool called MPlan. The downside is that casual users can't get this kind of information. They rely on specialist researchers that they pay to conduct runs and write reports. Next slide. What we'd like to see is this kind of information easily available. MPlan estimates parsed by subsector size and geography on a dashboard for free whenever you want. Next slide. Who benefits from that? All of us do. Nonprofit leaders, advocates, people investing in the nonprofit sector, people that are providing public support to nonprofits. Next slide. This only gets done if the project has value. National research shops can conduct this work. Let me turn this off here. If there's a vision to get it done, cash, time, vision, and collaboration in order to get this kind of economic valuation data out into the world. Next slide. I'd love to talk with folks about people who think this kind of information could be valuable, or if you think it's not. Both of those things would be valuable to us. Or if you are a potential partner in getting this kind of work done, we'd like to talk to you as well. Talk to me, talk to Tanya, and we'd love to move towards a vision of making this kind of economic valuation data broadly available to everybody in the nonprofit sector right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. What a great idea. I know a lot of organizations would benefit from a dashboard like that. Next, I'd like to welcome Chantel Ramsunder and Harar V.A. Hall to present a paper that they wrote with Leah McCarroll titled Building Better Strategies Towards a Multidisciplinary and Equity-Centered Framework for Research and Storytelling in the Nonprofit Sector. Chantel Ramsunder is a public health researcher and knowledge translation and mobilization manager at Volunteer Canada, where she supports equity-oriented research initiatives such as the Data-Driven Engagement Project and the National Volunteer Action Strategy. Harar V.C. Hall is the Policy and Research Manager at Volunteer Canada. They exemplify the verbiage of thinking globally while acting locally. In recent years, they've worked alongside community organizations, nonprofits, and municipalities as a facilitator, educator, researcher, and consultant. Chantal and Harar, welcome to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Kara. As Kara said, my name is Harar Hall, and I'm the Policy and Research Manager here at Volunteer Canada. And I'm joined today by my colleagues Chantel and Leah, who will be supporting us, answering any questions you may have about our methodology throughout this presentation. I feel really lucky to work with two brilliant, insightful researchers who are deeply rooted in strong community-based methodologies and impact. And I know we are equally glad to be here on this panel with researchers and practitioners who are dedicated to impactful data storytelling and impactful programming across the sector. Next slide. So, as was mentioned, I come from a background of strategy building across nonprofits and municipalities. And the thing that I learned from my experience within strategy building, especially strategy building that is anchored in community-based research, is that no strategy is created in isolation. We understand volunteering to be a deeply integral part of the broader nonprofit landscape, the democratic process, and the longevity and resilience of our communities. However, we also understand that we're building a strategy within a sector that struggles with capacity, with coordination, with fragmentation. And so when building the research and engagement methodology for this strategy, my focus was on ensuring that we were attempting to solve for some of the issues that we have identified as being key pressure points in the sector's data collection and knowledge mobilization practices. We thought it was important that our data be able to map onto other sector data sets as much as possible. We are deeply committed to making the National Volunteer Action Strategy data sets open source, and we highlight the research methodologies, projects, and pilots of our partners across the country as much as possible in our reporting so that we're not duplicating or replicating, but referencing things that already work. Next slide. So what is the National Volunteer Action Strategy, and why do we think that this is a useful pilot for the methodology we've created? This is a once-in-a-generation effort to reimagine, restructure, and sustain volunteerism into the future. Volunteerism, civic engagement, and community participation is at the heart of every nonprofit, every community, every neighborhood, city, province, or state and country. And the pathways to volunteering, its opportunities, and its barriers impact everyone. This is a unique strategy that allows us to engage across subsectors. So we're speaking to everyone from folks regarding animal well-being to environmental advocacy, to arts and culture, to sports and recreation. We are engaging folks across geographies. We're looking at cities. We're looking at urban centers, rural, remote, and suburban areas. And we're also looking at the different ways that demographics and lived experiences navigate the volunteer ecosystem to answer really substantial questions that plague us at a nonprofit, but also societal level right now. Things like, how do we work together? How do we create environments where everyone is entitled to the health benefits that community participation and volunteering provide? And how do we brace ourselves collectively for crisis? Next slide. And so we have thought about this a lot across a model of what I refer to and what you'll hear my colleagues refer to as the volunteering ecosystem. And I would say that this is an ecosystem that is really useful because it can map onto many other dimensions of nonprofits across North America. We think about volunteering at an experiential level, and that's usually the level that concerns the individual and the volunteer experience. And so we're thinking about things like motivations, barriers, reasons for wanting to get involved, and reasons for staying involved. We're thinking about infrastructure in terms of the volunteer infrastructure, and this concerns organizations and institutions. And that's where we get into best practices across the sector, policy change, sustained support for volunteer managers, and sustained investment into nonprofits. And then we think about the societal dimension of volunteering, and that concerns our collective well-being. And that's when we get into questions around the overlap between volunteering and things like health and well-being, emergency preparedness, democracy, isolation, and the crisis around loneliness, and the ways that this acts as a solve for many of those really, really large societal questions. Across these levels, we aim to collect quantitative data and qualitative data that are constantly in conversation with one another. Next slide. And so you'll see we group our data collection and mobilization efforts into three mixed methods, and this has been the anchor for our strategy just thus far. So our data analysis of existing sector data sets inform the questions at our roundtables and key informant interviews. Our initial findings from roundtables and landscape reviews informed our survey design. Our survey results inform our working recommendations, which will be shaping our upcoming roundtables and subsector roundtables. And all of these qualitative and quantitative data methods are anchored and supported by storytelling and knowledge mobilization. And we think that storytelling is unique because it is true that a lot of people respond within the sector, within government, and across funders really well to numbers, but we think that data storytelling allows for those numbers to be infused with humanity. Storytelling offers the opportunity to engage in qualitative data collection at the same time as knowledge mobilization. So you're both collecting and sharing simultaneously. It passes the mic to people across the ecosystem that find themselves to be over-consulted and underserved. And it often speaks to the elements of all of the dimensions of that volunteering ecosystem that we're anchored in an effortless but deeply, deeply human way. And I'm going to pass it off to Chantel to speak more to why we choose this methodology specifically.
Right. Our framework is only as strong as the knowledge that it helps translate, and knowledge is only as valuable as a resource as we have to share it. So right now, I'll quickly take you through how we make this work by keeping equity at the core and building in collaboration with community, nonprofit, and policy partners to build a framework that leads to thoughtful resources and ultimately impactful recommendations for our National Volunteer Action Strategy. Next slide, please. When trust and equity are embedded, impact naturally follows. So while our article spends time on a few guiding principles, I want to highlight today Lincoln and Guba's trustworthiness scale. It gave us shared language to balance rigor, relevance, and equity, all integral to our framework. So this scale includes credibility, which reminds us that even a single story can be evidence when it's collected with care and connected to broader methods. That story can spark deeper inquiry. Transferability, which ensures that if something happens in a rural community, that lesson should carry through to the decision-making authorities in our nation's capital in Ottawa. Scalability, which challenges us to design outputs that matter at every level, from the volunteer manager focused on retention to that policymaker thinking about workforce sustainability. Equity, which keeps us honest by embedding inclusion from the very start, so no voice is left as an afterthought. And collaboration, which reminds us that we never do this alone. Community and nonprofit partners bring findings to life. The scale has long guided fields like public health and environmental science, in turn policy. And these are disciplines that understand how systemic forces shape collective experience and how urgent it is to share insights within the current moment. Bringing that same lens to volunteering is vital. In the sector too, equity must be a through line, so both in research and the stories that we tell about it. To see this in action in more of a broad sense, I encourage you all to take a look or scroll through the What We're Hearing report, which is going to be a link in the chat. And the report is structured around the 3 NVAS dimensions mentioned by Harar. It services both the middle of the bell curve and the edges. So we want to not only insight sort of like the general ideas that we're seeing, but also what's on those curves of sort of, like I would say, not deficit models, but what's on the curve in terms of barriers, but also areas of resiliency. Next slide, please. I want to quickly talk about the Threads of Us report. It's a look at volunteering, care, and kinship within the 2S LGBTQIA communities. So here we use a mixed methods approach, weaving together history, storytelling, and research so that both evidence and lived realities were used to shape the findings. Through the 3 NVAS dimensions, we captured volunteer stories at the experiential level, the role of clinics and organizations at the structural level, and cultural preservation at that societal level. It's also deeply equity-centered, looking at 2S LGBTQIA+ voices that lead the narrative, and we highlight not only just the systemic neglect, but also the resilience that these communities continue to build. This is part of a commitment we have towards using asset-based language. And through knowledge mobilization, we make sure that the outputs are actionable, linking to stories directly to surveys, blogs, and consultation reports. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So equity isn't just something we add on at the end, it's what we embed at the very start as a principle of design. So regarding quantitative data, we want to be using specific national data sets, and we want to pull information such as having to do with income, immigration, and geography. And we also want to focus on, as I mentioned before, actionable outputs. So it's really important that the knowledge that we create are things that are shareable, accessible, translated, given the Canadian context. Next slide, please. Regarding next steps, we're continuing consultations with volunteer organizations. We're meeting with sector-specific partners, as Harar mentioned, and we're expanding our research and collaborations to some more rural communities in Canada. And at the same time, we'll be drafting the strategy and recommendations so that by 2026, which is the International Year of the Volunteer, we hope to showcase the framework, the strategies, and recommendations to the sector as a whole. Next slide, please. This brings us to the end of our presentation. I just wanted to share a heartfelt thank you to Kara for moderating, Emily, and the team that put this together. We really appreciate being here today and look forward to learning more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal and Harar. What a powerful framework. I look forward to grappling with how I might use parts of this framework in my own work. Thank you. Next and last for this first panel, I'm pleased to introduce Anne Seawright-Cristiano and Nicole Brazen to present their paper, Engaging Government and Leveraging Data and Storytelling. Anne Seawright-Cristiano is the founder and director of the Center for Public Interest Communications and a clinical professor in the Department of Public Relations at the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications. She developed the first ever curriculum in public interest communications, connecting practitioners and scholars who are already working in the field and nurturing and sharing research that can advance this newly emerging academic discipline. Nicole Brazen brings journalistic roots and an advocate's passion to her role as the Council's Vice President of Communications and Content. Most recently, she was a senior communications officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, working to ensure that everyone has a fair and just opportunity for health. Nicole and Anne, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you as well to our co-presenters. Fascinating stuff. We are going to keep going with the storytelling frame. Data is so important to everything we do. So we want to really bring it home about how you can make sure that that data really tells the story that you wanted to tell and gets the results that you want to get. Anne.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. Next slide, please. So you may have seen this report that came out earlier in August from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, pointing out that the top 5% of their reports have been downloaded 5,000 times, but that most of them, or many of them, 1 in 5, had received fewer than 1,000 downloads. And the UN is producing really important research and really important data. So is the World Bank. Next slide, please, who found in 2014 that 1 in 3 of its reports had not been downloaded from its site a single time. So I think we know that the charitable and humanitarian sectors are really clogged with these kinds of reports, and there's so many kinds of challenges associated with using data to drive change. Reports regularly go unused, and it's also true that all the data in the world can't create change in the systems that really need it. So we also know that despite our best efforts, people rarely make decisions based on data. And in reality, they act when they care and when they know what to do. So our sector has to invest in designing its outputs for the people that they hope are going to use them.
Yes. Next slide, please. So to that end, we have 3 actions that we think organizations can take to make sure that the data that you are producing and working so hard to put out there is useful and used. The first one is to tell stories that bring meaning to the data, overcoming existing biases, and obviously pointing toward solutions. You want to make sure your data design and collection is centered on the decisions that are actually available to policymakers. So what are they actually considering? What can they actually change? And then, of course, use accessible language and metaphors, because if people can't understand what you're trying to say, they definitely can't make decisions. Next slide, please. Speaking of trying to figure out what you're going to say, we saw this, I think it was last year, from McSweeney's Internet Tendency. We love this slide. We love this site, and in particular, this piece, which is titled, "We Dare You to Figure Out What Our Nonprofit Does." Has some great language here. You'll see on our website some inspiring photographs, young people planting a tree, a diverse group of folks chatting on a street corner, and an unhoused person being handed a meal. You might imagine this means we plant trees, help young people, or serve food to the unhoused. But honestly, do you think we'd make it that easy for you? And I think, next slide, please. This really kind of synthesizes what's wrong with the way that we talk in the sector. And by that we mean, the nonprofit sector generally, but also philanthropy in particular. There's very much this philanthro speak that we see, and it has actual repercussions and very serious ones. So just this year, Congress included language in the tax bill in the early drafts that would have increased the excise tax on private foundations up to 10% in some cases. So going from 1.4% to up to 10%, which means less money for grant making, less money for communities. And that warning was clear. Next slide, please. The warning, which is the lesson that we've learned in this research, is that when we talk like that McSweeney's article, people don't understand what we do. And they don't understand how much it matters to them, including Congress. So case in point, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy did some research in 2023 in which the stat that really stood out to me was this one. They asked people, did you or someone in your household receive services from a nonprofit within the past year? And literally 5% of people said yes to that question. And when I saw that, I thought that's crazy, 5%. But when you ask someone about a nonprofit and about services from a nonprofit, they're probably thinking about food pantries or homeless shelters, right? They're not thinking about youth soccer leagues. They're not thinking about churches, and they're definitely not thinking about the daycare that they just dropped their kid off at. Next slide, please.
And so what this means is that there's a narrative vacuum around the sector. And that means that we're open to having other people figure it out for themselves or interpret it on our behalf. And that especially means that policymakers in particular can fail to understand just how much the charitable sector supports communities across the nation.
Next slide, please. So what does this mean? It means we need real transparency. And by that, we don't mean 990s and all kinds of data about a bajillion dollars that foundations gave away, but actual information about what is happening. So that's what we did in a 2-year study between the Center for Public Interest Communications and the Council on Foundations. We were really looking to see what kind of stories and what kind of language can build understanding of our sector and, of course, trust, because that's the most important thing. In the first phase, we did a landscape scan, really looking at survey data, news, and opinion. I mean, just thousands of pages of materials, including our own websites and other things. And we found that the sector really hasn't told its story in a way that sticks. Philanthropy and other charitable nonprofits are really a blank slate for Americans, and that makes it possible for others to advance their own interpretations of the sector. Next slide, please. So we set out to answer 3 questions. What shapes perceptions of foundations among policymakers and the larger public, and how do policymakers shape others' perceptions? Secondly, which storytelling elements would increase the public's understanding of and trust in foundations? And number 3, how do communications practitioners in this field approach their work, particularly storytelling, and shape public discourse and perception?
Next slide, please. So as we designed this project, we used a mixed methods approach, and we were able to include a national survey of nearly 4,000 Americans, in addition to our content analysis, social listening, a survey of practitioners, interviews with practitioners, and interviews with policy staffers. And 2 aspects of this research really focused on policymakers and their staff. Our interviews with the legislative staffers told us that they want to hear from leaders in the charitable sector. They want those relationships, and they want to know about the work that's happening in their states and communities. And in the content analysis of every congressional research report in the past 5 years, we learned that elected officials rarely make formal inquiries about the sector. Next slide.
So here's what we found. The sector has faced a lot of scrutiny, and indeed, we found ourselves in harm's way in the tax bill negotiations. And so we really wanted to dig down into what stories will work, what language will work. We tested 10 different versions of the same story to find out just what kinds of details and formats did the most to build understanding of the sector. And that's because we found essentially in that first piece of the work that we did that Americans generally have positive views of philanthropy, but don't understand the role it plays. In our research, we found that members of Congress generally were pretty interested in collaboration and with foundations. They wanted to partner. We found that the sector has not effectively established a shared narrative. So that's that blank slate that we talked about, the narrative vacuum. And then everybody really wants foundations to be more transparent. How do things work, right? Not just how much money did you put out at the problem, but how does it actually work? We found that jargon and borrowed metaphors just really obscure the role of foundations in the larger system of change. And we found that the storytelling that we're doing really kind of lacks funding for the long-term change that we need to see.
Next slide. So it really matters what kinds of stories we tell. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we saw is that, yes, every version of the stories that we told built trust, but some of them were a lot more effective. And the ones that did the most to build trust and understanding were the ones that explained exactly where the money went and how foundations and nonprofits made decisions about what the programs would look like. Next slide. So we weren't at all surprised to see that all 10 stories build trust and understanding, because Heather McGee said in The Sum of Us, everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. And research by Dr. Emily Kubin suggests that stories can overcome deep political and moral divides. And research by Rebecca Heady, next slide, please, suggests that in the absence of a narrative, people are going to use data to affirm their existing beliefs. And she found that sharing data about racial disparities led some people to rationalize why those disparities might exist. So we see from her work that we really need that context to help people understand how policies might lead to disparities. Next slide.
Actually, one more. And one more. There we go. We're going to have to end here because we're getting the dreaded warning that our time is nearly up. So we really want to share with you the 6 insights from our research. You can see them here. Tell stories within complex ecosystems. So don't make things too simple so people can't see how change happens. Lean into your role as trusted messengers. Commit to sector-wide storytelling. So that's really that unified voice that we need to have in our sector. Tell stories that build the right kind of transparency, and say what you mean what you say. Use words people understand. And then again, narrative work is long-term work. We need to commit the time and the resources to see it through. We look forward to answering your questions on this. And obviously there's some links in the chat that you can check out our research, and the raw data actually is also on our website.
Great.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everybody.
much. Yeah, thank you, Anne, and thank you, Nicole, for that fascinating presentation. I can't believe there was a report on there being too many reports. And now I am pleased to ask all of the panelists from panel 1 to return to the spotlight for our 20 minutes of Q&A.
My video is disabled.
I think we're waiting for 2 more people. Well, while they figure out their camera issues, let's get started with the first question in our Q&A. There was so much overlap between what you all are thinking about and the problems that you're trying to solve. And some of the things that stuck out to me was the narrative vacuum that we have. And also at the same time that we have this narrative vacuum, there's this sort of social media space, which condenses everything down to these little snippets, but then at the same time trying to pass the mic to those who've been underserved and oversurveyed to tell their own complex stories, and wanting to zoom out so that we can tell this big impact story. And wow, if that isn't the story of the nonprofit sector. So I wanted to start with this question, which is for everybody. So whoever wants to begin can begin. And in this day and age of press hits and social media clicks to help us measure impact, Are there other ways that your research might illuminate for us that we can measure the impact of the narrative change work that we're doing, or the impact that nonprofits are doing every day for policymakers, other than these sort of click rates or press hits? Are there other platforms that you would recommend that might allow us to do either that bigger picture thinking and also the more complex thinking, and different types of media for different types of storytelling that you might recommend?
I hate to jump in first.
Please do.
I'm the one guy in a panel of all women. I don't want to jump in first. But I'll say that this is a question that I tried to address directly in my presentation, and that policymakers are a audience for the stories that we tell. And the stories that we tell can be augmented by data that we can collect. And data is available in the nonprofit sector. Some of it's easy to summarize and some of it less easy. So I think if we go to the work of summarizing that data and making arguments around it, that can be persuasive to policymakers at all levels. I think it's hard to move policymakers at the federal level right now. That'll change over time. But in our states and our local levels, stories imbued with data are going to go a long ways in helping to continue to rebuild the nonprofit sector as it is right now.
Thank you, Mark. And I see you have your hand up.
I just want to chime in with one of the things that really stood out to me in the work that Nicole and our center did was the importance of that relationship building, the fact that so much of narrative is transmitted face to face. And I think we sometimes kind of post stories or share stuff on social media with this sort of fluoridation mindset where we put it in the water and everybody's teeth get stronger. But it doesn't work that way. It would be great if they did. It definitely doesn't work that way in Florida anymore. But it's really important to really think about who your stuff is for and making sure that you are bringing it to them and building that relationship, even if the person who can benefit most from your research is somebody who you don't necessarily agree with or see as an ally.
Thank you. Harar.
Yeah, I think that like a thing that I feel like we get caught up with a lot of times is trying to find the one right strategy for communication. And the fact of the matter is there is no one right strategy for communication across a country, across a sector, across, varied like states and municipalities or provinces. That we keep trying to essentialize it down to like, everyone responds to stories, everyone responds to data, everyone responds to face. And I think that and this is something that we've been doing a lot at our organization, getting out of the idea of a singular motivation or a singular call to action and diversifying your message, diversifying your methods for engaging so that you are hitting as many people as possible and getting just away from this idea that we're going to find a magic bullet to communication. There is no magic bullet. It's varied approaches.
Thank you. Chantel.
Yeah, and I think just to quickly riff off what Harar mentioned too, I think there's a bit of a concern sometimes in research, especially folks that are a bit newer to the qualitative field, that you might run into things like contradiction, that you might run into vastly different views and ideas about things. And I guess my advice is don't freak out. This is normal. This is what happens when you're doing good research. You're, on both sides of that bell curve and everything. So kind of embrace those outlier ideas and opinions, because maybe that's an indication that you're sort of hitting stories and demographics that probably have not been captured from beforehand. So it's important to be pragmatic about that, not to get too worried about it, and make it part of that process.
Thank you. Julie.
I think for me and for us, we are not researchers. We are a small nonprofit, and some of what has worked effectively for us is not telling our own story, because I think people know that you're going to tell your own story and you're going to position yourself as effective. But for us, it's been families talking about what they've gotten from the program, young people, collaborators in the community, but that when other people in the community carry your message and someone, a policymaker hears that message, and then it's like reaching out to you, or when you reach out to them, they say like, oh, DOMAS, I've heard of DOMAS, has been an effective strategy for us.
Thank you, everyone, for those answers. So I hear letting others tell your story for you, not looking for a magic bullet, diversifying, getting face to face with people and telling your story. Thank you for all of those pieces of wisdom. So I'd like to move on now. We have a question from the audience for Julie and Amanda. Julie and Amanda, could you explain a bit on how active slots translate into long-term impact?
I'm happy to start and then would love Julie to add. I think the active slot definition helps us to know in the short term if an organization is putting in what they need to, so that putting in what they need to in terms of services, so that they have a reason to believe that in the long term they'll deliver on that ultimate impact that they've promised to their participants. So it's what you're able to look at and manage and monitor. Ideally, an organization is also monitoring short-term outcomes, right? And they're looking at the two side by side to think about, what are we putting in? What are we seeing in terms of progression? What does that tell us about what we need to keep doing, more or less of, or differently, so that ultimately we do get to what we've promised?
Yeah, I would say for us, for our organization, our big bet is what is going to change the life trajectory for young people who've been disconnected through no fault of their own from systems that were supposed to help them, is this idea of this like loving relationship. So we have to measure it. We have to measure, are young people engaged? Are they meeting with the person they're supposed to meet with? And if our big bet is that is going to produce short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes, it is the first step, especially with young people who are disconnected. There may be a long on-ramp until you're seeing, long-term outcomes. We're talking about years and years, not months and months. So this is a pathway forward to know you're on the right track.
Thank you for that answer. The next question is for Chantel and Harar. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why you decided to structure your framework around the experiential, the structural, and societal dimensions.
Chantal, I don't know if you have, maybe I'll start and then I'll let Chantal sort of dive in. I wish our other co-author, Leah, could also hop in, because I think that she has a lot of really great insights on this as well. But what I will say, I think it's like largely very pragmatic in terms of the sort of large buckets of people or stakeholders that we're trying to serve, while also centering impact. I think that it's actually really easy for organizations like Volunteer Canada that are very focused on capacity building and pan-Canadian relationships, or national relationships, to not get detached from impact, and to not only think of our only stakeholder as sort of the sector. What I would say these sort of buckets and levels allow us to do is ensure that we are contributing to and hearing from people, like individuals across the country, and that is sort of being fed into the infrastructural and organizational stakeholder that we oftentimes have the most conversations and most interactions with, and then translate to impact, so that is what we're rooting in, both for our organizations and also for individuals. I think it's easy for people to sort of get detached from volunteering, especially young people, or to think of volunteering as a nice to have. And I think what that sort of societal dimension reminds us and anchors us in that it's not a nice to have, but it's a must have, that this is deeply, deeply necessary. And I think it helps as like a through line in terms of starting really small at an individual level all the way up to a collective level. So I think it is also really good storytelling in that sense as well.
Yeah.
Chantal?
And just to quickly add to what Harar was saying, translation is a big thing here because especially for policymakers, I think it's kind of difficult to put together a narrative that quickly when you see buckets like this. So in Appendix B of the paper, we sort of drafted what the flows look like between experiential and structural, and sort of add a description and add an example to that. And those examples are very much grounded in experience, like what anyone would sort of experience, any story that you'd ask a policymaker, any insight that you'd ask a volunteer manager. So these are very much grounded to like certain realities, and having the 3 buckets help sort of take out the experiences in those like realities, and then see like, oh, okay, so this means an investment in infrastructure. This means an investment into like individuals and their ability to navigate certain like volunteering spaces and things like that. So it became a really good tool to show that interconnection without getting too complex. And so bringing more people in, some of those actors that need to be there for things like funding, things like furthering the sector and developing.
Thank you both. So we have a couple more minutes left, 2 minutes. And so I'm going to ask this question and start with you, Mark, and then open it up to anyone else, because it's such a good question from our audience member that might apply across to these other panels that are coming next. How can a cost-benefit analysis be used when the outcomes are a bit challenging to define quantitatively, such as an aspect of character, self-confidence, or self-actualization, or are difficult to directly connect to long-term outcomes, such as did an event increase knowledge of the org or result in increased donors, increased giving, increased engagement? So Mark, I'll start with you.
That's a question I think Jill had asked in the Q&A, and we had a little bit of back and forth on that. Seems to me to be an evaluation question. I'm thinking sector-wide for the most part, or subsector-wide or community-wide, but individual organizations certainly have to prove their worth as well. And there's a whole domain of evaluation that sort of tries to address that question. Jill's asking about some things that are hard to measure, and that is the Achilles heel of evaluation. Sometimes we try to evaluate things and it's where we're measured only the things that we can measure, and we end up with the things that we didn't necessarily need to know about. My reaction to her in that question is that I think the things she's talking about are measurable. You just have to get with people who are experienced in trying to measure those kinds of things, find a reliable way to do that. And then I think a traditional evaluation approach could go a long way towards the situation that she's describing here.
Thank you.
Amanda, you're wagging your head. Your thoughts about this one?
I agree with you. I mean, I think even, the examples that were shared, I do think you can measure those things. I think there's validated measures out there for some of those things. For others, I think you can create one as a nonprofit wanting to measure and monitor it. But what I would think is that's really would be most helpful for the internal purpose of the organization to understand the progress that they're making, and that at the end of the day, the nonprofit would still have a socially meaningful outcome in terms of the change and the knowledge and skills that the participants they've been serving have been able to develop because of the services they got from that organization.
Right
Thank
on.
you, Amanda. Harar.
Yeah, I completely echo everything that Mark and Amanda is saying. One thing I'd just add there is when you're thinking about like those qualitative measures and that you're trying to not just necessarily measure for an organization, but across the sector, because I also saw a question about the sort of the sector as a whole, I would say it becomes really, really important to have standard measures and like shared understandings of the things we want to measure and the questions we want to ask across a sector, whether you're organizing by region, whether you're organizing by subsector, whether you're organizing nationally, so that those indicators can be rolled up and tell the story of the sector as a whole. I think that finding those measures and then sharing them and standardizing them and making that part of our collective storytelling is how we measure those things, and is how we do participate in the case making and the data storytelling to support sustainability.
Thank you, everyone, for your insights and your wisdom today on this panel. And I am now going to turn it back over to Alan to introduce panel 2.
Thank you. Thank you, Kara, and presenters. It was important and helpful to hear about data about volunteerism, about economic impact, and about apps not on an iPhone, active program slots, and also about, especially from our last panel, last presenters, about how to tell stories. And I do think we need to dare each other to tell stories that people actually understand. So we've got our work cut out for us. Well, let's move to our second panel, where we will be looking at how to advance nonprofit impact through advocacy and civic engagement. We're thrilled to have David Suarez, who's been on the faculty at University of Washington and taken on a new position as Associate Dean for Research at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the university. David's particularly interested in nonprofit collaboration, advocacy, participation, civic engagement, some of the issues we'll be talking about, issues that link nonprofits and foundations to government agencies and the policy process. David.
Thanks for that introduction, Alan, and welcome everyone. That was a great first panel, and I'm sure it is going to continue here. This particular topic, I can't imagine being more timely. There are just so many issues that are occurring, and it's not just an issue of misinformation. There's suddenly a tremendous amount of ambiguity. One example would be the Johnson Amendment, people are familiar with, and I know is an issue for the National Council of Nonprofits of, is it okay for religious organizations, other nonprofits to electioneer? In the past, the answer has been no, but suddenly there's some ambiguity. Also, things like nonprofits that have federal funding suddenly are facing some pressures as to what they should do about lobbying, which is legal. They are allowed to do it, but suddenly there's pressure. And those of us who are paying attention, there's also tremendous pressure on the nonprofit sector in general, whether it be universities. There's just all kinds of issues that have to do with the voice of the nonprofit sector. So for me, advancing nonprofit impact through policy advocacy and civic engagement couldn't be a more timely topic. I think it's relevant. And I will turn it over to the speakers to give us their insights on these questions. There are 3 papers. The first is using civic intent insights through the lens of belonging, trust, and depolarizing attitudes to strengthen nonprofit advocacy in the United States. The authors are Mark Max Meister, Annie Collins, Samir Khan, and Woodrow Rosenbaum from Giving Tuesday. The presenter will be Mark Max Meister. Mark leads data science initiatives at Giving Tuesday, specializing in analyzing pro-social behaviors and civic engagement patterns. With a background in anthropology and computational social science, he's developed innovative approaches to measuring community generosity and belonging. His recent work focuses on the relationship between giving behaviors and social cohesion. Mark, I will turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. And I think our slides are there. They are. So I guess we can go to the next slide. Oh, wait, I'm not seeing my own slides here. Are you showing them? Okay. So as David mentioned, Giving Tuesday has a group of about 40 people that look at the data side of the global philanthropic sector and generosity ecosystem. And we're going to talk about a new metric that we're calling civic intent. You could think of it in plain language as a way of understanding how people's willingness to contribute in their communities is part of building a better community and how it relates to trust, belonging, depolarizing attitudes, their media landscape, their politics, and so on. Next slide. As I mentioned, Giving Tuesday, so we have a group of people. Broadly, what our group does is we have about 180 data sharing and collaboration agreements with other groups that have data about philanthropy around the world, mostly in North America, but definitely in over 100 other countries we have contacts. We also try to take that data, digest it into something that's more usable for a variety of audiences and make that publicly available data on a large scale. So we talk to reporters, we talk to platforms, we talk to nonprofits, funders, all the sorts of people in the ecosystem. And we write our own reports about trends that we see going on with the world of generosity. So in plain language, civic intent means doing good regularly. That's important in our study, and therefore recently, and having good intentions towards one's community. We have an index of currently 14 questions that we use to calculate a score from 0 to 100 that we can assign to people in surveys. The 14 questions cover things such as our version of pro-sociality and civic engagement, but excluding voting and activism for reasons I'll mention later, trust either of people in your community or of nonprofits, and then also some questions that we would call depolarizing attitudes. We find that this overall metric is generally independent of things that in the demographic sense you don't really want to have as covariates. So independent of gender, ethnicity, age, income, and employment status. Next slide. So the data that we're going to show for our validation in this come from two sources. We've been running a weekly national cross-sectional online survey of generosity for the last 3 years. We have over 20,000 responses since 2023. This data is publicly available to anybody who wants to do research on it. And part of that is these 14 questions that we use for civic intent. We also ran a shorter version of the same questions in a global 7-country survey in March this year. And I'll show that in some of the slides to show how this works outside of just a single national cultural context. Next slide. So this is going to dig in a little bit about when we say that you have a score from 1 to 100 on civic intent, what do some of those component questions look like if you were to map that out? So for example, if you take some of the questions we have about whether or not a person did something in their community in the last 7 days, and if not the last 7 days, when was the most recent time you did one of, in our case, 12 different forms of generosity? You can look at the average of everybody who said, yes, I did something the last month, or no. And the people who say yes to that one question would have an average score of 73 on the scale. And those who said no would have 48. And the average for civic intent across all of these questions is around 60. If you look at that for someone who just did this in the last 7 days, you see that that entire scale moves up closer to the highest possible thing. So 84 for people who said yes to this, 60 for people who said no. What that means in a practical sense is when you're trying to score how active people are in their community and how correlated the things that people do to help others are to each other, people who have done something to start something in their community in the last week and happen to show up in our weekly survey having done this are somewhere around the top of the most active people on the scale. If you follow this further down, you'll see at the bottom, like at least one of the things I did, one of my generous acts mattered to me. People who say no to that have a 38. And people who have never performed a random act of kindness for somebody before, according to our survey, have a 37 on the scale. So at the bottom third. Next slide. Or just click through. I just want to point out, so like you can use this to look at like what's a typical behavior in the US context, what's a predictor of the highest civic intent, and then what percentage of the population did these things. So in our weekly survey, on average, 8% of everybody initiated something, but 90% of everybody had done some random act of kindness for somebody before. Next slide. So these are the social behaviors that are also in our survey that can tend to correlate with civic intent, but none of these measures are used to calculate our civic intent index. So if you've recently heard something, whether positive or negative about a charity, that has a correlation of 0.35, which is, reasonably, for social science, that's reasonable. That's a positive correlation. If you see reminders about solicitations for nonprofits, that's also a positive. All of the things on the left are positive social interactions, and you'll see that because we're talking about social behavior and pro-social, meaning wanting to do good in your community, you'd expect those things to be correlated. On the other hand, the things that have a zero correlation are like what language you speak at home, gender, income, age, whether you're white or non-white. And then we use Pew's research political typology for our political spectrum. It groups people into 9 categories based on their worldview, and that broadly means something liberal, moderate, and conservative, but don't exactly mean that. And we don't see a correlation with that either. And this is a sample of over 5,000 people over the last year. Next slide. Okay. When you look at depolarizing attitudes, the 3 questions that we mentioned that we use to calculate this, that are 4-part Likert questions, meaning agree, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. I list those on the right. So for example, if you agree with the statement, I'm helping to make my community a better, more civil place, or I strive to help those most in need, even if that means helping those in my particular community less. Most people around the world agree with all of these questions to some extent. So in the blue and the green, those are the people who have a score of 50 or better on these 3 questions specifically when you average them. So somewhere around 80% of people in all of these countries agree with those statements. And you can see that there is some difference in culture around the world. So India and Kenya, far more people agree with a depolarizing attitude towards their community and their country than in the other 5 countries that we've looked at. Next slide. We also have activism questions, which are not calculated as part of this, but you can see that they are correlated together. If you click through, I think, yeah, because we're short on time, I'll just talk about community intent belonging. We have 4 belonging questions in the survey too that are from the National Belonging Barometer. And 2 of these are positively framed and 2 are negatively framed. We find that people with high civic intent tend to also have very positive scores around feeling a community sense of belonging. And conversely, people with lower civic intent, shown here in the red bars, have less feelings of belonging when you talk about the positive questions. The negative ones, there's still a relationship, but it's less of a strong correlation. So feelings of exclusion or not feeling like an authentic member of your community, there's a relationship there, but it's much weaker to belonging. And there are some other things we looked at that you might expect to be related to these feelings. So being strongly religious or having a belief that people can trust, so a strong trust that tends to make people less likely to feel a lack of belonging. Next slide. We also ask people what their most common trusted sources of media are. And then we looked at that using 3 different other measures of where that falls on the political spectrum against civic intent. And so if people tend to choose left-leaning, centrist media or right-leaning media, interestingly, we find that civic intent is higher among people who have either left or right-leaning media, but no relationship with centrist. And if you had some of your trusted media comes from a none of the above, meaning it's probably not a corporate media or not a mass media source, that is higher among people that have the lowest civic intent on the scale. Next slide. So all of this is to show up as a tool that could be used by researchers and storytellers in order to provide a metric that can talk about what it means to be an active member of society and actively contributing to the well-being of your community in a positive way that is somewhat independent of things that often are not the story that we want to tell. So independent of all those measures I mentioned, and a little bit better than using pro-sociality, because we're talking about measuring what people actually say they did in the last week rather than a generic, I feel like I tend to do these things kind of measure. And I think I'll just save the rest for questions later. I'm sure you have a lot of questions about this, but we would love to collaborate with you, and we could, all of this data is public. We can help you use the index in a way in your research and in your storytelling. Next slide. That's it.
Great. Thank you for that presentation. I certainly am interested in hearing more about the relationship between civic intent and civic engagement, policy engagement. So hopefully we'll have a chance to talk more about that. The second paper here is From Exclusion to Inclusion, Measuring Transformation in Nonprofit Civic Engagement by Caroline Mack and Kimberly Carroll Cox, both from Nonprofit Vote. Caroline is the Senior Communications and Impact Strategist at Nonprofit Vote, where she harnesses the power of listening, curiosity, and storytelling to amplify the civic engagement work of nonprofits and community leaders. Kimberly Carroll Cox is the Associate Director of Development and Communications at Nonprofit Vote, where she advances the organization's mission of increasing civic participation through nonpartisan voter engagement. I will turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you. So before we talk about our findings, we want to thank the Symposium Committee for this amazing opportunity to share our emerging research as a nonprofit that works between practitioners and research. And so I am Caroline, the Senior Communications and Impact Strategist, and Kimberly.
Hi all, pleasure to be here with you today. I'm Kimberly Carroll Cox. As mentioned, I am the Associate Director of Communications and Development with the team.
And so it is Kimberly and I's hope today that everyone connects with something from our presentation today, but please see our full paper given the limited time that we have. So both of us have been at Nonprofit Vote for 5+ years, and our mission is to provide tools and resources to help nonprofits integrate voter engagement into their ongoing services. We are also the managing partner of National Voter Registration Day, which is next Tuesday if you haven't signed up yet.
Wonderful. So this is really a topic that we're both deeply passionate about. And before we begin sharing, we'd love to dive into some of the context as to why this is important research to us, not just in the professional content, but individually exploring our individual voter journeys and how that has shaped our perspective on both inclusion and agency. So from my background, as Caroline mentioned, I've been with the team for over 5 years now, very much seeped into the voter engagement space. And it may come as a surprise for you all to hear that I actually registered to vote for the first time last year. Granted, that was immediately after becoming a naturalized citizen, of course. Additionally, as a development professional, I've always been very interested in capturing metrics beyond, impact beyond metrics, particularly through expanding storytelling to identity impact, in which much of our work to capture that moment of inclusion has been centered on.
And for me, as an undergrad, I studied computer science and behavioral economics at MIT, but I never thought of myself as someone civically engaged until getting involved. So this feeling of exclusion to inclusion is very personal to me as well as professionally relevant, because I also ran Nonprofit Vote's multi-state field program where we organized hundreds of nonprofits over the years to incorporate civic engagement in their activities. And compared to some of the larger GOTV methods, our reach looks smaller. It's in the tens of thousands, not millions. But we had interviews with these staff, and I saw and felt really big impact. So what we're going to be sharing today is from these qualitative interviews with nonprofit staff, where we repeatedly heard stories of transformation, of voters who really began a conversation saying, I don't know enough, voting isn't for people like me, and ending with, actually, I can vote, or actually, this does matter to me. So together, Kimberly and I really want to share a broader framework to capture on a scale how these interviews made such an impression on us and how we tell that story of impact.
Next slide,
Sorry,
please.
next.
Great. So in the limited amount of time we have with you today, we hope you really take away two main highlights from what we think our paper offers. And the first is really recontextualizing the conversation around voter apathy to what we call civic disconnect. So for us, civic disconnect is really an umbrella term for the many different circumstances that prevent otherwise eligible Americans from turning out to vote. And while it's true, some folks may simply not be interested in voting, which is absolutely their right, to assume every eligible American who does not vote is apathetic is simply not true. And so within this, we acknowledge that there are many other reasons that people may not turn out to vote. And today our paper exclusively focuses on those exclusionary emotions and considering what those are, where they come from, and how nonprofits are uniquely able to help people move past them. Our second takeaway is really offering a new framework to consider metrics and measurements, including the outcome of voter and civic engagement as inclusion through shifts away from those exclusionary or negative emotions that impact action. And in our paper, we go beyond counting outputs such as doors knocked, voter text sent, and try to move towards indicators of true outcomes of civic engagement, which we define as inclusion. So let's dive in and talk about what we currently measure and what is missed when we currently measure in taking someone to take an action. Next slide, please.
Okay, this one. So anyone who works in civic engagement knows that the primary metrics are like how many doors knocked, text sent, registration collected. But these are outputs, not indicators of outcomes. So let me underscore the difference through an evaluation lens. For example, an output could be the number of voters you educate at a workshop, but the outcome is increasing democratic participation in our community. So the indicator, the metric you want to track to make sure that you're moving the needle on that outcome can be how many people are voting, so turnout, or how many people feel like they know enough now to vote after your workshop. So the current metrics of number of registrations, texts, et cetera, assume that if we help them overcome a barrier, like completing a voter registration, reminding them of a text, their polling place, they'll vote. And that is true by lowering what is commonly known as activation energy. But what is also true from our interviews is that instead of just lowering barriers, we can also increase capacity, clear barriers to a person's inherent motivation in working through an action. That is one of our key findings from our interviews, that nonprofit staff would help people work through deeper barriers, their negative or exclusionary emotions around voting, clearing the way for civic action. So exclusionary emotions from our interviews, these are some of the examples of how they showed up and what they sound like. So for example, shame, I already know how to vote. I should already know how to vote. I lack ability. Fear, I'll make a mistake, I'm not capable enough. Isolation, I have no one to ask, I'm alone in this. Invisibility, my experience isn't worth sharing, I've been left behind. And powerlessness, I won't matter anyway, voting isn't for people like me. And so these are especially prevalent in local elections where terms like levies, zoning, insider-outsider dynamics, they heighten all these negative exclusionary emotions. But what we heard was that when nonprofit staff really helped overcome these barriers, people could summon and that activation energy to take action. And they flipped the narrative, people not caring enough, recontextualizing it as something very personal, that the relationships nonprofit staff had made with people made it so that people felt safe asking for help. So instead of just measuring outputs, we want to try and measure these shifts in emotional states from exclusion to inclusion. And before we get into the metrics, we want to share a little bit how this shift happens. Next.
So at Nonprofit Vote, our theory of change is really centered on the idea of supporting nonprofits as a means to fostering a more inclusive democracy. And for us, that's really because nonprofits have trust. And I think something we can attest to is in high demand and low supply. And so really through everyday actions of helping individuals move beyond survival mode, nonprofits build inclusion and trust through showing up. And this extends to voting. In teaching someone how to use a QR code to register to vote, that says, I want to include you. In showing someone how to navigate a sample ballot, that says you can do this and your voice does matter. In registering someone to vote for the first time, that says you belong. And we have 2 additional blogs that go in depth based on 2 interviews that demonstrate this in more detail, which I believe will be dropped in the chat. The first really uses joy to vote, a joy of voting to tackle fear of not having the confidence to vote. And the other works on making people feel safe and not ashamed to admit what they don't know. And in using these examples, as well as the others mentioned in our broader paper, we really highlight how these feelings of exclusion can be transformed into inclusion. And so you see some of those emotions outlined here on this chart below, taking fear from what sounds like I don't know enough to confidence and I know enough to. Next slide, please.
So here are some sample ways to measure, including that emotional state. If this looks simple, it actually is. You can take this and implement it right now. So one way is exit surveys with statements that get at those positive motivators or reduction of negative blockers. So for example, Likert scale, so strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree. Maybe you feel, I feel more confident voting now, or I know what to expect at the polls. You can also do before and after self-assessments on readiness. So for example, I know what to expect around voting. Before and after, scale of 1 to 10, maybe it goes from a 5 to a 7 or a 3 to a 5. I feel like my voice does matter. Maybe their agreement with that statement is 3 to 6. Either way, we're trying to get at that I don't know how to vote to now I feel confident voting and I feel like my voice doesn't matter to I feel like my voice does matter. The last way is going more into voter turnout data. So looking at folks who re-engaged after not being engaged. For example, they haven't voted in a couple elections and now they vote in this election that you engaged them in. And so we encourage you to see the full list in the paper and to reach out a few ideas and thoughts on this too. Next slide.
Great. I know we're coming up to the end of our time, but in our final thoughts with you all, I'd love to leave you with some final thoughts and considerations. Rather than a call to action, I leave you with a call to consideration. And so for nonprofit folks on this call, we offer a new lens in naming and measuring impact, as well as inviting dialogue. And this is something that can indeed be used beyond civic engagement. So think about how this may apply to your broader missions and demonstrating impact. For those of you who are on the call who are funders, we offer a case for investing in belonging and tracking emotional transformations and considering those opposed to traditional metrics that are more aligned with numbers. And lastly, for researchers, we give you a call to consider capturing lived civic experience and identity shifts. And as Caroline mentioned, this is still emerging research. And so if anyone is interested in continuing the conversation, we'll be dropping our email addresses below. But thank you all for your time.
All right. Thank you, Caroline and Kimberly. This was, I thought, a very useful paper and hopeful. I liked the focus on empowerment. It gave the impression not just that these things could be measured, but that they could be changed. So thank you for that. The third paper today is Leading Others to Join, Influencing Nonprofit Sector Policy Through Moral and Fact-Based Messages by Allison Grayson at Day Consulting. Allison Grayson is a researcher and consultant based in Charleston, South Carolina. For over 20 years, she's worked to help community leaders identify big picture solutions to tackle difficult problems. Currently, Allison consults with universities, national associations, and local nonprofits on trends impacting civil society and advocating for public policy solutions. Allison, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, David. I'm going to wait for my slide to come up because I did choose to change the title from defense to offense. So I'm using a sports analogy, which is not my natural proclivity, but I think it's appropriate here because a sports analogy allows to get across two hopefully hopeful points. One is that in sports, you have playbooks because there's more than one way to win a game, and you have to use different plays depending on who's on your team, who is the opposition, and the environment that you're playing in. And that's the same for nonprofits in a policy space. The other is this idea that maybe some of the insights from these other presentations, which really complement this research, can help nonprofits think about how to shift from defense, which they often are on defense in a policy space, to a more proactive offensive position, particularly in the current environment. So if we can go to the next slide. I want to offer one caveat, which I'm glad I'm grouped with these other papers. There's a lot of reasons why nonprofits choose to communicate with various audiences. This research is specifically on how to drive action, how to get enough support from a broad enough cross-section to get results. And so that's where we're coming from. There are other very legitimate reasons for communication, but we're not going to talk about those today. Next slide, please. So the problem I'll speak to briefly is essentially we're trying to figure out how nonprofits can effectively build enough policy support across a wide variety of audiences that will drive action and get results. And that end part is key. You have to get people to join you so you can get results. It's not just enough for people to kind of give you lip service and say, oh, sure, we support you, but we're not going to introduce a bill, we're not going to vote, etc. So that's why I like my fellow papers in this cohort also focus on the action orientation. Some of the significance is that we're testing nonprofits' assumptions with this research on what are effective advocacy messages, and then what could effective messages look like in terms of design, and how does the policy issue that's being tested impact it. This research focuses on testing different types of messages and how they create support among the general public for nonprofit sector issues, not individual nonprofit issues. Next slide, please. I want to give a literature overview only because I find the literature even more helpful than the research itself. So from a follow-up perspective and providing you with resources, I want to focus on this for just a minute. The literature informing this work comes from three spaces. One is psychology literature, literature about nonprofit sector advocacy and collective action, and a very small amount of literature that exists out there on nonprofit advocacy communications and what works best. Next slide, please. Some of the highlights of this research that I want to make sure we talk about, because it'll help us understand the findings. One is that cognitive psychologists have basically said emotions drive a lot of human decisions. It is actually the default way that we make decisions. That includes political decisions. And facts are often used to support those emotional decisions that we make. What triggers these emotions often are shared morals and values. That's what gets us either to work together, or it actually can pit us against one another. And the key is that advocates must match the right morals to the right audience. And if you don't match them up, you risk further alienating or strengthening opposition against your cause. Next slide, please. Another piece in literature is that facts are often most useful for people who don't already have an opinion about a policy issue. You help to educate them on that issue, and then they form an opinion. The challenge here is that sometimes this, even if the facts educate them and result in a level of support, it might not be enough support to drive action, or at least drive action as well as an emotional connection to the issue might have done. Nonprofit sector issues often lack salience. We heard this in earlier presentations that people just kind of don't get sector issues. And that links to the topic above, which is if you don't understand it, you often educate with facts, but that may not create a strong level of support. And finally, personal messages or human-centered advocacy messages are often the most effective. Talking about people like me, people in my community, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a few minutes. Next slide, please. Just really quickly, this is some of the things we don't know from existing literature. And it's just a couple of these questions are what this research tries to start answering, but a lot more research is needed. Next slide, please. Methodology for this. So this research consisted of 5 surveys across multiple years. They included surveys pre and post pandemic across 2 different political administrations and political environments. So each survey not only has the benefit of testing different messages and different policy issues, but also testing those issues in a different political context, which is helpful to understand how those variations might change the level of support that is registered by respondents. Next slide, please. Key findings. The biggest key finding is values did outperform fact. So we had a list of factual messages and we had a list of more emotional, values-based messages. We tested both across these 5 surveys. And on net, values did perform better in generating more support, stronger support that could drive action compared to facts. Only, this is the asterisk, if it matched the right values to the right audience. If it was mismatched, then fact-based messages performed better. But then there's this question of whether or not the support they generated was strong enough to drive action. Facts do still add value. They legitimize and provide a lot of support for values-based and emotional messages. They also create an opportunity for common ground across diverse audiences and the ability to identify, oh, this is a space where we might share something in common, and let's try to build our coalition around this value. And the most surprising is that audience were motivated most by values other than equity, and that included left-leaning audiences and audiences of color. Next slide, please. So really quickly, this is a general audience. So if you're looking for which values performed the best for everybody, if you're doing a massive non-targeted campaign, values around fairness, caring for others, and something I call tribe, but this is that people like me, my community, people I know. Next slide, please. When you disaggregate across independent variables to see what played a bigger role, age came out on top. I have a hypothesis. I think this may be connected to engagement, which I'd love to talk to Giving Tuesday and others about this more. But for the purpose of this call, I think we'll move on to the next slide. So the fact that very few respondents preferred equity, and in fact it ranked in the bottom, is often the most surprising finding from this research. It even runs counter to some extent to literature. What this doesn't mean is that no one supported equity, period. It means that other values were stronger motivators for action than equity was, and there may be some really good reasons for that. I have my own hypotheses I'm happy to share if we get around to it in Q&A or afterwards. But it doesn't mean that no one liked equity or proportionality or fairness, because we tested kind of all three aspects. Next slide, please. Implications for practice. I think you must test messages for various audiences. There's no guarantee, even if you choose the right value, that the way you write the message is the best or most effective way. You want to moderate your fact-based messaging. I find in the sector, we often think, well, if they just know us better, if they just know our work better, we will definitely convince them. And maybe we don't always lead with facts. Maybe we also complement facts with more values-based narratives. Check your bias. There is a lot of research that says we as nonprofits and in general are likely to write values-based messages based on our own worldview and not that of our audience. So we have to make sure we're not creating biased messages that turn off audiences. Increase public engagement. That's that issue salience challenge of people don't understand us. I think there is a huge public engagement issue where if people aren't engaging with nonprofits, it's going to be harder for the sector to make that people like us personal tribal message relevant. And finally, re-examine structure. So as one presenter said earlier, some of the values that they talk about aren't just applied on the back end, it's a part of the design of their work. So you want to make sure that as you design your work, you make it flexible enough that you can use different values for different audiences when you finally get to the communication stage. So John Powell with the Othering and Belonging Institute writes a lot about this and is a great resource. Next slide. And that's it. I look forward to our Q&A. Thank you for your time.
All right, thank you, Allison. So much to discuss on that paper and these others as well. So if I could get everyone who presented to come back on screen. I think that's everyone. Yeah. All right, let me start with a question that maybe we can call this public education, but there were some questions that were submitted before the presentations, and I think they're pretty important for highlighting the work you do and this relationship between policy advocacy and civic engagement. Question was, how can you advance nonprofit impact through civic engagement if your organization is not involved in policy advocacy? And any of you can answer this, but Giving Tuesday and Nonprofit Vote both are doing work that I think absolutely informs nonprofit impact through civic engagement, but isn't necessarily at all trying to change policy through advocacy. So I wanted to just frame that and say that, it seems pretty clear that you can do both, but let me see how you two feel about it and your reaction from your organizations.
Yeah, I can jump in really quick. Definitely civic engagement is broader than policy advocacy, and that includes voter engagement. And as Kimberly was saying, everyday trust building, civic engagement as inclusion, belonging, that's the nonprofit part of the work right there. Our nonprofit power report also looks at turnout. So there's also a way of, maybe you want to be involved in policy kind of power building, but not necessarily direct policy advocacy. And so power building is both an influence question as well as a community question. So you can connect with your unique community, make them feel seen, understand their barriers, as well as take that voter turnout data, bring it to your legislator, bring it to your representative to be like, hey, we're engaging our community. You should listen to us, build those moments of kind of cross-silo connection so that people can talk to each other. So you can build influence even if you're not directly doing policy advocacy and hopefully build power.
Yeah. If I could add, I totally agree with your assessment, David, that being in the advocacy space doesn't mean that you have to be political. So Giving Tuesday is not a political organization. And also because we operate in over 100 countries, that would be a real problem if we were political. What I've been told by the local organizers around the world is that politicians would rather like show up at our national global day of generosity because it helps them more than that we are advocating for their power. They're trying to use our power. And there's a book that our co-founders mentioned called New Power that kind of talks about this as a different way of thinking about how power systems are created and how they manifest in the 21st century. I haven't read it, but that's probably what they would say if they were here.
Great. Thank you. This question's for all of you, but perhaps Allison mainly. Something my students always say is if you're teaching us these tactics, but anyone can use them. And so, once everyone knows them, it works for either team, whatever policy you may have. So these, the findings you have would apply regardless of what your policy position is. I'm just curious how you think about that and what that matters, if it does, the way you think about these things.
It definitely matters. And in fact, there's a great academic, George Lakoff is a linguist, and he wrote some books years ago that was complaining because he said, the other side is doing this, and my side that I support is not. So yes, any side can use it, but if one side is better than the other, then it's not even an even debate, right? And where I want to get the nonprofit sector to is politicians are already using this moral framing, this emotional appeal. The opposite side to a lot of these frames are things like fear and othering and those types of things. They're all using it. And if nonprofits are in that conversation, but they're just showing up with a 500-page report and not addressing the more visceral emotions that are involved, that's to our detriment and the detriment of the people and communities we serve. So I think just an awareness that this is a part of the dialogue and we want to be educated enough to be able to participate in it when needed is really important because others already are.
Yeah, could I add something? Like we now have public data anyone on this call could do research on about media landscape and how it relates. There's never been an easier time in history for code switching to be like a thing you just do, because you could take that and do an analysis of how dissimilar everybody's media landscape is from each other, meaning that if you were a bad actor, you could say completely different things to different people on different channels and they never would notice because they don't overlap. That's just an interesting time to live in, that's now the reality.
Kimberly or Caroline, want to add anything or?
Nothing that's already been said that aren't other questions as well.
Great. Well, let me turn to another question that I think maybe extends a little beyond any of the research you're doing here, but it was submitted and I think it's worth at least asking and getting your insights because it does relate to the topic. It says, how can organizations work together to increase effective advocacy in the charitable sector? And the reason I'm bringing that up is there were some questions in the Q&A about this, and how some of your research and the way that we've talked to one another, it does seem like collaboration is possible, and it doesn't have to necessarily be political, but it could still, civic intent, right? That it's an important concept. And same with what Nonprofit Vote is doing on empowerment, and the way that you talk about things, right? The presentation Allison gave, all of these seem to have some relevance for thinking about collaboration and working together. So that's the way that I'll frame it. See how all of you react to that.
Yeah, I'll just jump in really briefly to say that, even though we're in the civic engagement panel, we see a lot of possibilities of kind of taking our just framework into other areas of the nonprofit sector to talk about stories of impact, story of transformation. A mother escaping domestic violence experiences hope, a parent ashamed of needing food assistance finds dignity. So that kind of like before and after transformation. And I love being a part of this panel because, we're talking about emotions, we're naming things that we may not really, I feel like this is a watershed moment where we are all collectively naming a lot of these barriers as they are surfacing very powerfully around the sector, and appreciate kind of the space like this to have that conversation with people who are also thinking about it at the same time, and acknowledging that this is new to us and we are all trying to figure out what is the best way forward.
Absolutely. I think one thing I would add to that too is I think in advancing conversations around policy, specifically from the position that we operate at Nonprofit Vote, we are very big on the educational piece. And I think that speaks to our ability of, taking a look beneath the hood and investing in emotions and sort of having those conversations with folks and potentially working with them to make the connection to say, we're a food bank and certain policies impact the way in which, school meal access is operating within our school districts. And so that would be, a piece of advice that I would give to folks, is just continuing to strengthen out those educational opportunities if available, or just helping folks make that one-to-one connection in those day-to-day needs, which is particularly relevant in a local election year as is.
Yeah, I would say that advocacy is not one direction. It's not that nonprofits advocate to politicians that then make new policies. It's actually is much the opposite. There was someone that, I think her name is Hari Han, who was talking about people have to belong before they'll believe something. And so all of these organizations on this call have much more power over shifting social norms on a local level, which then politicians come along and they try to adapt to what those norms are and change their policies because they want to get reelected. So think about advocacy not as just a bottom up, but it's also a person to person. It's very local and it's very based around belonging.
I just wanted to ask one last, or build on one last piece that Mark mentioned, which is this idea that also we need to make sure we get to know the politicians. I hear a lot in a lot of nonprofit coalitions of they don't understand us, and therefore I need to tell them about us in a way that I like to talk about myself as a nonprofit. And I think it would benefit us to spend more time understanding our audience and what's important to them from a relationship building standpoint. And then we can cater to their goals and see how that aligns with the work we're doing a little more effectively. I think sometimes we just, when we get into these coalition spaces, start talking amongst each other and kind of forget that it's not really about us. It's about either our communities or the people we're trying to get to support those communities.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and riff off that too, is that none of our findings would be possible if we didn't really put our active listening hats on. We checked our assumptions about why are people not voting? Could it be that they not care? And realized, oh, that is actually a belief that we kind of have, is that they don't care enough. But actually, we're remaining curious, we're remaining open. We invite people to a space where they feel like they can show up, bring those complex, bring their full selves, and really get to meet them where they're at.
This is great. I wish we weren't running out of time. We have about 3 or 4 more minutes here, but there are some very nuanced questions here that I don't think we'll have a chance to get to, but we'll make sure they get to the authors and hopefully they'll be able to respond. There is one here that is, it's more for Allison, but I think all of you can answer it. It says this offensive versus defensive advocacy strategies, and are there examples of how these can be framed to defend? Sorry, all these new questions are coming in and I lost the question I was looking at. Sorry, it sort of disappeared. But the question was, how do we use that concept to defend the sector as a whole or specific subsectors? So how can we leverage that concept?
Sure. And I think this can relate to the other panelists' research as well, that the idea is if you know what motivates people or what their concerns may be from the outset, at the very beginning, you can start developing ways of talking about your work that, one, don't necessarily invite criticism. So you can kind of stay below the radar, which I think is a lot of nonprofits' goals right now. Well, it's corporate goals too. But you can also respond to criticism in ways pretty quickly that isn't just on the defense, like, oh, I have to defend my use of this term or how I framed or talked about this work, but instead use it as an opportunity to connect with this different audience that doesn't already support you, using terms and values that they understand. And say, I understand you. I understand this is important to you. And this is how it connects to the work we're doing. And we really are on the same page. It might not seem like it, but here's how we're on the same page. And so it's also a way to de-escalate. I think Mark used some type of term like that, the conversation a bit, and try to find common ground more quickly. But the offense part is you can anticipate what some of that pushback and opposition could be on the front end and start developing those messages at the outset before they even go out the door.
Yeah, like
and I can speak to more on equity, but I know my fellow panelists have something to add.
I think Harvard's example in February was the best media blitz example I've seen in decades, where they said, we're going to change our policy. We're going 100% against the Trump administration on this. And they redid their entire website top to bottom to align with their messaging at the same time, which I think, Allison's saying, yes, that's the sort of stuff that we could be better at. I also think that community cohesion is the biggest way to be resilient against attacks. So the more that nonprofits are seen as not just in a community, but they are the community, that they represent the best of what that community offers, it makes them more powerful than the politicians that might want to attack them.
Yeah, and just talking on resonance, making those values real instead of talking about big abstract values, making that day to day. No one deserves to go hungry. Everyone deserves to work if they want to. I saw a question about persuasion versus alignment, and really effective persuasion has alignment. Good alignment includes powerful persuasion. So, just using all these communications and segmentation tools and testing to just keep playing around with it, know that no one has the answer. You'll probably be in the best seat as anyone to give it a shot, and we just keep experimenting with that, with the craft of communications.
That's great. Thank you. This is a great way to conclude. But before I hand it off, let me thank Independent Sector, ARNOVA, and Nonprofit Policy Forum for putting this together, for giving this venue for these great papers, not just in this panel, but in the one that precedes it and the one that's going to follow. I believe I turn it over to someone now, to Alan, and I'll go ahead and do that. Thank you all.
Thanks. Thanks, David, and thanks, presenters. I think we moved in the first panel, talked about data and stories, and I think in this second panel, we've moved towards action. How do we activate people to vote, and how do we affect policy? And speaking of action, we've thrown a lot of content at you, and we're going to give you a chance to move around on your own. I will resist giving directions to the restrooms, but imagine you can find them on your own. And we'll give you about 10 minutes and reconvene at 3:25 for what really is, I think, another really interesting panel on nonprofits in this time of some hostility, some authoritarianism. So we'll be back at 3:25. Thanks. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are going to turn to our third and final panel, elevating nonprofit impact in restrictive political climates, which have been, unfortunately, become more commonplace in the last few years. To moderate the panel is my colleague and friend at George Mason University, Stefan Topler. He is a professor and director of the Public Policy and Administration faculty in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason, which is the largest public university in Virginia. Stefan's recent research has focused on civil society in authoritarian contexts, the subject of this panel, government foundation relations in the US, and the relationship between the sectors generally. Stefan.
Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon, everybody. Delighted that you're still here this late in the afternoon, but I'm sure it will be worthwhile. Restrictive context, yes. There have been concerns about shrinking civic space for around 20 years now. It was originally focused on the Global South, within the global backlash against democracy. Then in the early 2010s, Russia really put the topic on the table by cracking down on certain types of NGOs. Now, what they went after were human rights organizations, including LGBTQ+, environmental organizations, and democratization groups, of course. Unfortunately, though, this cancer has been spreading not only across the global south, but also into the global north. So in recent years, we've seen a backlash against NGOs and repressive tendencies in Europe, in the United States. And it really has become a pervasive problem. Now, Nonprofit Policy Forum has published several papers on this in the last couple of years, and I'm delighted that we're going to continue this discussion panel this afternoon. So the first presentation is going to be on resistance and resilience, LGBTQ+ nonprofit response to the Trump administration by Irvin de Leon. Irvin is a faculty member of Columbia University, the School of Professional Studies, and also a lecturer in the nonprofit management program. He also serves on the boards of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center of New York City and the Samarthya Foundation. Irvin.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. So if I can please have my first slide. So next slide, please. So this research happened fairly recently in July and August, a conversation with 17 leaders of LGBTQ+ organizations during a time that really they're still trying to figure out what happened and how to respond. And among the 17 leaders, these included mostly EDs, executive directors, some chief COOs, and also a couple of board members, and mostly from the New York City area. However, these leaders are also in touch with their peers all over the country, and it seems the experience has been shared as well. And basically, I ask these leaders, how has their organization and also their constituencies been impacted by the Trump administration's mandates and policies? And then how have they responded? And what is their outlook for the future? So next slide, please. So first, what happened? And this happened really quickly, beginning in January, and with a barrage of executive orders that targeted the community, the LGBTQ+ community, as well as DI initiatives and policies. So those two together, along with bans, healthcare bans, sports bans, military bans, bathroom bans, you name it. And then also at the state level, to date, there are 604 anti-LGBTQ+ legislation at the state level. ACLU tracks this legislation. And what is alarming about what's going on is, yes, everyone who belongs to the queer community is at risk, but especially transgender and gender nonconforming folks. But also, queer immigrants who are clearly affected by the anti-immigrant sentiment and policy. But at an organizational level, what does this mean realistically? Defunding, right? And this goes for a lot of social service organizations as well. And loss of funding was anywhere from 20 for larger organizations to 70% or more. Never forget my conversation with the leader of a community-based transgender organization who said that she doesn't think her organization will survive this year. So it's very serious. And so this is what the organizations are facing. And let's see how they've responded. Next slide, please. So a number of things. The response, clearly reorganization. So for instance, I sit on the board of the LGBT Center here in New York City, the second largest in the nation. And we lost 2.6 million in funding out of a budget of about 18 million. So that meant really a lot of thinking, a lot of reorganization, and our center, along with other LGBTQ orgs, have lost or had to let go of really dedicated, passionate staff. So that's number one. Number two, having to find other revenue streams, which is not, while it is an option, the reality is that neither the philanthropic sector nor the corporate sector could possibly cover the loss of government funding, particularly federal funding. And corporations as well has sort of backtracked out of fear of being targeted by the current administration. Now, it seems like the most effective response for the moment, and it seems not just for LGBTQ plus orgs, but for other organizations, is litigation. At the very least, it put certain mandates and certain laws and certain regulations on hold. So there's a breather there, and that's one way that LGBTQ plus orgs are responding. And finally, active resistance. And in this case, I actually want to quote something that was said by the first trans person who started a national org, where she said, "What you must do is try to win. If you can't win, slow it down. If you can't slow it down anymore, make them pay politically." So that's the response to date. And let's just see the next slide, please. And so what does this mean for the queer organizations moving forward? First of all, there's an acknowledgement that a year to even as soon as a year from now, but particularly after 2.5 years, however more years we have, is that it will be a smaller sector, a smaller subsector. There will be far fewer LGBTQ plus organizations, and the ones remaining are the ones that really, in a way, fought through this and figured out how to survive, right? The second thing is there's a call for unity. Some folks are saying, listen, this is not the first time this has happened with the LGBTQ plus community. There was a time when we took care of ourselves. But the reality is, and they're referring to the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 80s and the 90s, but the reality is, it's not as unified as it was then. The reality is we're faced with a community that has a lot of cleavages, even within itself. Just talking about the L, the G, the B, the T, and the Q, and the IA, and then talking about differences in gender and sexual identity, race, ethnicity, class, political affiliation, you name it, geography, right? And that's within individuals. And when you talk about organizations themselves, the queer space has grown so much, which is a good thing, but folks also organizations work in silos. So, focusing on different areas of service, but also serving different folks. So how do you bring all of this together? Which leads to one idea is that, and this is where philanthropy can come in, because I've seen myself, having been in the sector for well over 3 decades, that foundations have a very important place for convening nonprofits and bringing folks together to work together. So figuring out how can these different LGBTQ orgs work together. And then the second thing is how do we go? We need the support of other organizations and other communities beyond the queer community, which leads to really what, listening to the first 2 panels, a lot of good ideas. How do we communicate the cause? How do we get folks to come to our aid or to work with us and what have you? And I think, one thing that has been said in this symposium, as well as outside, how important it is to tell our stories and make it, what our shared humanity is. But I think one reality that has been alluded to and discussed in earlier panel discussions is that the reality is we might be telling our stories out there, but who's listening? And what are the venues for where we tell our stories? So ultimately, it's how do we get people to understand what's going on within the community and our organizations. So next slide, please. And I just want to end with a couple of quotes and, answer any questions at the end of this panel. But the first one is very optimistic from Ben Garcia, who is the executive director of the American LGBTQ Plus Museum, where he is very optimistic, but unfortunately highlights the fact that right now it is horrific. It really is for the community, particularly for the TGNC community that really is so targeted right now, never mind the fact that they constitute only 1% of the population, right? But the thing is, one thing that was so inspirational from talking to these leaders is that, everybody knows it's going to be a very difficult next few years. But as each one said, no, we're going to fight, we're going to survive this, and we're going to get out at the other end stronger and better. And then from Cristina Herrera, who is the founder and CEO of Trans-Latina Network, right now we just need to get through the storm. And we need to be able to save ourselves to fight another day. And I think that is what these organizations are doing right now. As I said earlier, these are early days, sadly, but already it's awful. The harm's been done, as we all know, and it's just going to get worse. But hearing from these leaders, I am confident that the subsector, the LGBTQ plus nonprofit sector will survive. But in what form remains to be seen. So I will continue my research moving forward and revisit all these organizational leaders in the next year and the following year, but also talk to the staff as well as the folks who benefit from these organizations. So, and then that, thank you. Thank you.
Great. Great work, Evan. Let's move on to the next presentation, which takes a more international view, I think. It's called Legitimacy Under Watch, How Transnational Environmental NGOs Build Credibility in Authoritarian Settings. It's presented by Jahan Shabik, who's a postdoctoral researcher specializing in environmental governance, civil society, and compliance in authoritarian contexts. She recently defended a PhD at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies, congratulations, where research focused on the strategies of transnational environmental NGOs in China and Turkey. Sharon?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. Hello, everyone. First of all, apologies for having my video being so dark. It's night here in Germany, so I have to deal with this. We can go to the next slide already, I think. So let me start with why I think this discussion on legitimacy matters, not only in authoritarian context, but also in the US. So I won't repeat what others said about shrinking spaces and the repression on civil society in general, because many of you know this firsthand. The space for nonprofits is becoming more constrained, whether through political polarization, declining trust in institutions, or pressures to do more with way fewer resources than you are used to. You don't need me to tell you that. So where my work adds value is by looking at NGOs in even more restrictive contexts. So in my case, during my PhD, this was China and Turkey. So these are the places where civic space is not just shrinking, it is actively being policed. So advocacy can be treated as subversion. Transparency can trigger further surveillance by police or the state. And yet NGOs continue to operate to build credibility and even to influence policy in these contexts. So what I want to highlight here is kind of twofolded. First, authoritarian pushback against civil society is sharper than ever. So in places like China and Turkey, NGOs operate under surveillance, restrictive laws, and the constant risk of being branded as political threats, or in Turkish case, it has been for years, they were branded as terrorists or foreign agents. So secondly, we have seen in the past couple of years that democracies are not immune to this phenomenon. In the US or elsewhere, nonprofits are facing their own legitimacy crises, whether through declining public trust, political polarization, or growing pressures for accountability without adequate resources. So by studying how NGOs adapt under authoritarian conditions, I believe we can uncover strategies that are not just about survival in authoritarian settings, but also offer lessons for sustaining legitimacy here in the US for you, maybe in democracies where increasingly contested civic spaces are happening recently. So I did extensive field work with transnational environmental NGOs in these countries. My goal is to not only to show how organizations adapt to authoritarian systems, but also to highlight lessons that maybe travel beyond authoritarianism. So this brings me to the question that drives my research: how do transnational environmental NGOs build and sustain legitimacy under watch in contexts where being too visible can get you shut down and being too quiet can make you irrelevant. Next slide, please. So what do I mean by legitimacy? At its core, legitimacy is about perception. It's the sense that an organization's actions are appropriate, valuable, and trustworthy within a given system of norms and expectations. So Schumann has a classic definition from 1995, which is a generalized perception or assumption that what an entity does is proper or desirable. For nonprofits, legitimacy isn't just about reputation, it's a vital organizational resource. Scholars like Balboa or Yiannakopoulos argue legitimacy shapes how nonprofits are evaluated by donors, partners, governments, and the broader public. So it's what allows them to access resources, build partnerships, and influence policy. Therefore, legitimacy becomes a crucial resource for these organizations' survival. But legitimacy is also very contested. So NGOs face increasing scrutiny, not just from states, but also from other actors. So like Delofree and Schmitz point out, corporate CSR programs, digital advocacy platforms, and even private philanthropies now compete for public trust. So Mitchell describes this as a future where NGOs risk becoming between power and irrelevance. That's the title of their book, which is, I think it's so relevant for what's happening for NGOs all around the world now. So, and we can't forget the North-South dynamic, right? So there has been a debate about how global North NGOs working in the global South established legitimacy for many years now. Are they partners? Are they outsiders pushing foreign agendas? And authoritarian states have been using this a lot in their discourses in the recent years, especially leaders such as Erdogan, who are trying to create this division between us versus them narratives in the local politics. So in restrictive settings, all of this becomes even more complex. Conventional signals of legitimacy, like public endorsement, media coverage, or government recognition, can be inaccessible, politicized, or even counterproductive. Too much transparency can invite repression, but too little also undermines donor confidence. So I think it was in panel one when Nicole and Anne talked about the right type of transparency, which is, I think, also relevant for the NGOs in authoritarian settings quite a lot as well. So that's why in these restrictive environments, legitimacy isn't a static status. It's not something you secure once and keep forever. It's a constantly negotiated survival currency, so which is recalibrated across audiences, political contexts, levels of risk. So for an NGO, this might mean presenting one version of its work to international donors, emphasizing impact and accountability while communicating a different version to the state officials, highlighting their technical expertise and alignment with policy goals. At the same time, they must reassure local communities that they are responsive and trustworthy partners. This is especially salient for the transnational NGOs because the public is often, especially in China, wary of these organizations, thinking, oh, these are foreign NGOs coming into our country. What kind of agenda do they have? So the critical point here is that legitimacy is not a universal stamp of approval. It is always relational, always contingent, and often contradictory. What strengthens credibility with one audience can create vulnerability with another. So my findings. So based on my fieldwork in China and Turkey, I found that transnational environmental NGOs sustain their legitimacy through three main strategies. These are framing, networks, and storytelling. So framing, in restrictive context, the way NGOs represent issues can determine whether they have seen as constructive partners or political threats. So in China, during the air apocalypse, maybe some of you heard about it, there was a huge smog in the sky, and people were thinking, oh, it's just smog, like it's nothing important. But environmental groups frame this air pollution as a public health crisis rather than failure of governance. This happened by providing reliable air quality data. They position themselves as problem solvers aligned with government priorities. In Turkey, NGOs often frame conservation in terms of national pride, playing into the nationalist rhetoric, protecting cultural heritage, landscapes, and the country's international reputation, rather than using the more politicized language of climate change. These examples kind of show how strategic alignment or framing allows NGOs to advance their mission without being shut down. Second is the importance of being embedded in networks. When formal recognition from the state is risky or unavailable, NGOs turn to networks as alternative sources of credibility. So in China, many groups embed themselves in partnerships with universities and research institutions, publishing scientific reports that authorities cannot easily dismiss. And in Turkey, NGOs often collaborate with local communities. And these partnerships act as what I call a legitimacy shield. They make it hard for the state to discredit or silence them. And last one is the adaptive storytelling and controlled transparency. So NGOs must constantly decide how much to reveal and to whom. They can report technical successes, water and air quality data, while omitting politically sensitive governance critiques. I think I forgot to tell you to change the slides. No, I didn't. Thank you. Okay. So we can go to the last one now, conclusion. So to conclude, the cases of NGOs in China and Turkey show us that legitimacy is not a fixed resource. It's not something you earn once and keep forever. It is continually negotiated process, recalibrated across audiences, political climates, and risks. So the strategies I highlighted, framing, networks, and storytelling just now, are not about survival, they're also about agency. Even in contexts where the state tries to control every move, NGOs find ways to reframe debates and to embed themselves into trusted communities and to tell stories that protect their space while still advancing and protecting their core missions. So in my opinion, these are acts of agency, not resignation. They are not being actively co-opted. They are actually actively resisting to co-optation. And this is what struck me most in my fieldwork. In Turkey, several NGOs told me that for them, the situation had recently become worse than China. Yet even as they described repression, they also spoke about how they adapt, how they build alliances, and how they hold on to their goals. They did not speak in terms of constraint, but in terms of creativity. So that persistence is itself a form of power, in my understanding. So why does agency matter? Because without it, legitimacy becomes a defensive exercise, something that imposed by outside actors or by the state. So what I found is that NGOs actively shape the terms of their legitimacy. They choose how to align with government priorities, when to highlight technical expertise, and how to present themselves to local communities and donors. So, and these insights, I believe, extend to contexts like the United States nowadays. Nonprofits face pressures around accountability, transparency, and partisanship. So the lessons from authoritarian environment is not just despair, but adaptation. To maybe finish this off, I'll leave you maybe with this. Legitimacy is not simply about being good at what you do. It's about being strategic in how you frame, connect, and tell your story. And perhaps most importantly, it's about holding on to the agency to keep doing that work, even under watch. This is what makes survival and impact possible, I would say. And on that note, I'm finishing. And let's keep connected. Yeah.
Great work. Thanks for the note of hope there. In an otherwise pretty dispiriting context. The third presentation is coming more from a practical side, right, Thomas? Thomas Schulte consults on policy development from conceptualization to implementation. And he has many years of experience working in the Senate on the HELP committee, which is Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, I think. And also from leading National Youth Employment Coalition. So he has background in both the legislative side and in nonprofit management and fundraising. And that gives him a pretty comprehensive view about how organizations can navigate and influence systemic change. The paper is Advocacy Arbitrage, Building a Nonprofit Advocacy Ecosystem to Withstand and Confront Authoritarianism. Thomas, go for it.
Great. I'm so excited to be here. I'm really grateful to see how many folks are here. I also am so grateful for Erwin's paper earlier. I don't think I shared this actually, but my sibling is non-binary, so I'm really grateful that you're doing that work. Yeah, it's great to be with everyone today. And yeah, you got my bio there. Just to quickly set kind of the context here, we're going to be discussing some difficult materials in the next few minutes. I'm going to be really candid with you. I hope that not all of you agree with everything I'm saying. We need, this is a time we need to be pushing our boundaries. So I look forward to your questions. I look forward to your pushback. I'm going to cover a ton of information here. You can find my slides and a lot more information on my thoughts on this at showalterstrategies.com/democracy. That's where I'm kind of going to continue adding my adding resources related to this. But the bottom line is we all have to work together, and I hope that you'll all stay in touch with me. You can move to the next slide. Okay, one really important thing to note is that just a note on terminology, President Trump is an authoritarian. He demonstrates all of the characteristics that we see in authoritarians the world over and people who want to be authoritarians. The Republican Party, of which he's part, and especially their elected officials, support him almost universally. He has a really significant infrastructure, conservative movement infrastructure that supports him. He co-opted and consolidated power within that network while also building his own power centers. Whether or not was an inevitable endpoint of that infrastructure is a topic for another day. All that to say, I'm going to characterize President Trump and his followers as an authoritarian movement and authoritarian infrastructure as behind him. I'm going to characterize a pro-democracy movement as organizations not that support another political party or a set of policy ideas, but simply support continuing the United States as a constitutional democracy. So just that's my quick note on terminology. And the other thing I want you to note is, we all have to be advocates now. We have no choice but to be advocates. As Jaron said, legitimacy can't be assumed. Our systems of government and civil society are contested. We pretend they're not, but we really, especially in this moment, we're all advocates, whether we like it or not. You can move on to the next slide. I just throw this up there. I encourage you to go read more about this. Reactionary tendencies, of course, have been part of political systems throughout history. I would kind of date authoritarian tendencies in the modern American context to 1933 and the business plot. You can go read about that at your on your own time. It's a fascinating story that actually involves Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush and grandfather of George W. Bush, as a key liaison between folks who were trying to overthrow the American government and the Nazi government. The Powell Memo is another key moment in terms of a document that really laid out a model that we see the authoritarian infrastructure still using today, and that I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on. The Federal Society and Turning Point USA I have case studies on the Federal Society and Leonard Leo and Turning Point USA on my website. Next slide. The Leo model, again, you can go read more details on this, but these are really key characteristics of networks and funders in the authoritarian ecosystem. It's not universal, of course, and there's a ton of great writing that's been done on this. Dark Money, the book by Jane Meyer, Rick Perlstein's 4 books on the evolution of the conservative movement in the United States are also amazing places to go for more information on this. I'm just going to say from my experience raising money from mainstream national foundations that they often operate in kind of the exact opposite way on all 3 of those points. So it's really important that we take on some of those lessons that the authoritarian movement has for us. Next slide. I also wanted to note that I, of course, created all this before Charlie Kirk was assassinated 2 days ago. The one thing I'll say about that is that it's truly a testament to the organization and network that he built, that this is such a huge national event. Turning Point USA is kind of emblematic of what can happen with the LEO model in terms of going through several reinventions, having funders that continue to support it, trying out all kinds of things, and constantly evolving. Next slide. So I want to really quickly walk through 5 quick lessons, and we're going to do it really quickly, but you can get more details in my paper and on the website. Next slide. So one thing, and this is something I dealt with a lot as a nonprofit executive, is getting folks to take on an advocacy identity, especially folks who might work in direct service work or things that seem distant from policy change, from let alone like pro-democracy work. But we really have to start getting more explicit about what our goals are. And that includes nonprofits, foundations, academics, policymakers. We really have to start pushing our boundaries there. And we can, I'm going to get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of what that can look like. Next slide. We also need to take advantage of a larger set of advocacy strategies than what we have been. And I just highlighted there are a few things that we need to be thinking more about, right? We're seeing that the elected officials are afraid of angering the authoritarian movement. They're not so afraid of grassroots organizations coming out after them. We have to think more about engaging in litigation around, I think there's a lot of opportunities for litigation around things like state constitutions, where, last year in Montana, they got a huge climate change win by doing a lawsuit around their state constitution. We also need to think more about what pro-democracy cultural products look like. I see some creators talking about some things related to voting and whatnot, but we need a lot more creators talking about the value of democracy, and non-political creators, people talking about sports who also talk about democracy across social media, in podcasts, et cetera. And it needs to be funny and it needs to be short. Next slide. So this gets into some of those nuts and bolts, 501c3 nonprofits. Big message there. You can do a lot more advocacy and even lobbying than you think you can. Read more about the 501h election, partner with a 501c4, and really challenge yourself to think about how can we infuse that advocacy identity, do more advocacy. Foundations, of course, getting away from project-based grants makes it much easier for especially 501c3s that might be doing direct service work to have the flexibility to also engage in pro-democracy work. I also, in my paper, note some ways that foundations can support lobbying. 501c4s partner more with 501c3s and take more risks. Next slide. And also do think about how to be explicit about your pro-democracy aims and be really thoughtful about, this is a moment where if you have board members who are not okay with your organization standing up for democracy, reconsider who's on your board. Next slide. This is kind of my proposal for a way to infuse more of that infrastructure building into the work of the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. Charitable foundations, think about setting aside 20% of your outlays for pro-democracy work, or build 20% into all your grants for grantees to do that work. Nonprofits, think about how to get 20% of your effort going toward pro-democracy work and seeking funding for it. Next slide. I just want to leave you with, that sense that, hopelessness, boredom, misery, apathy, those are all the tools of authoritarianism across time. If you're feeling hopeless, apathetic, like you can't make a difference, that's the goal. So I really want to recreate a movement and think about the future that we want. That means, fun. That's something that's so rarely centered in the kind of issue spaces that I work in. That means fun, joy, and especially using humor to deflate the authoritarian movement. That's a time-tested strategy. And honestly, it's so easy in the particular authoritarian context that we find ourselves in now. And the last thing I'll say, because I saw this in a couple of the questions that we got beforehand, is, in terms of a way to think upstream about these challenges and to manage risk, I'm a huge fan of scenario planning as an alternative to strategic planning. You can also find a piece on scenario planning and a tool that you can use on my website. But that's a huge way to manage risk in an uncertain and rapidly changing context. Yeah, I think I'll pause there, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. And please stay in touch.
Right. Thanks, Thomas. It's a very rich set of thoughts and conclusions to draw from this. Where do we start? Let's start with a question that came in earlier on the strategies for managing risk in fast-changing political environments. Right, so we had some reference to this. I think boards not supporting advocacy is a way for them to minimize risk for the organization. Difficult to overcome their other risks, their funding risks in particular, right? Do we have any thoughts on what strategies work best in this context?
I can say something about what scenario planning is if you want me to pick up on that.
Go for it.
Yeah, so scenario planning is, and there are different models of doing it. Like I said, I have a tool on my website, but the basic idea is you're getting really concrete about what are some different futures that, in this case, we might be worried about. And then we work, what are the specific things that would have to happen for those futures to come into being? And what actions can we take now to affect those different futures? But it's especially in this time, and this is actually, I started thinking about this based on some things happening at my church. It's about moving from that state of generalized anxiety into really concrete action while acknowledging that we don't have, strategic planning assumes a lot of agency on the, we can set these objectives and we can achieve them. Strategic scenario planning is more like we're clear on who we are and kind of where we want to go and acknowledge that there are many possible futures to get there.
If I can I jump on that? Because absolutely that's what we're doing at the center. We're looking at what might be possible, broader beyond just our organization and looking at the landscape. And in a way, I also want to address a question that Dennis Young had about funding. And so does that mean not relying on government funding? The short answer is absolutely. I mean, yes. But as I said earlier, it's not that easy to replace US government funding, federal funding, right? So, and relying on philanthropy will not work. So there was a 2023 study that estimated that philanthropy gave LGBTQ orgs 209.3 million. It's in my paper, somewhat like that. However, I just did some back of the envelope because there's no aggregated data of how much money was lost, particularly by LGBTQ orgs. But that said, looking at different data points, there's no way that that 209 million, even if that went higher, could be covered by philanthropy, right? So the question is, that's part of, totally agree, like scenario planning, the way I'd say that is like, okay, what's possible now if you want thinking outside of the box or what? And yeah, I think one thing in terms of funding is trying to get more individuals, right, to actually give more money because there is money out there. However, the reality is, just speaking for the queer community, the ones who hold the resources, i.e. the money, tend to be from a particular racial group and a particular gender orientation. It's just white gay men. I'm just going to say that. And unfortunately, not everyone thinks that they should support TGNC people. So what do you do, right? And then putting that aside, for those of us familiar with the giving data, it's sort of pegged at around 2%. Anyway, people don't give more, right? So it's really figuring out how do we manage things moving forward.
Maybe I can also bring some insights from the more authoritarian side of the countries. So what I was hearing from civil society actors was basically they need more people to become members, but they can't convince the public to become members to their organizations because people are afraid to be tied to these organizations. Because when the president of the country comes and says, look, these are the names of the organizations, whoever is associated with these organizations are terrorists, then how can these organizations can go to the public and say, look, we need money, we have funding cuts, we need donations, we need more members. It just unfortunately doesn't work for them. And especially in China, most of them were saying they are not allowed to accept donations or membership fees from the domestic public in China if they are registered as foreign NGOs. So they have to rely on international donors. And in that case, how can they convince international donors to give them money for their work because they are operating in China? So it's all very difficult. I wish I had more positive insight on this, but.
Yeah, I think what Putin really very effectively did was cutting off the international support to advocacy organizations, right?
Yeah.
That he cut off is the ability to go to scale, the ability to reach the public and the media, right? And that was extremely effective way to do things. And sadly, I think we are in the same situation. Now, also like in Russia, the corporate philanthropy stayed away from it, right? And getting the Russians to contribute to these controversial topics was a no-go. So the hope for finding domestic sources of support just dissipated pretty quickly, leaving some of the human rights organizations basically saying, well, we have to go back to what we did in the Soviet times, right? Doing everything on volunteer basis. But you know, it's a question of scale that goes away. So that's probably what we're facing too. And that gets to the next question here about corporate philanthropy, right? Is that something that we can rely on here in the United States for corporations to step in more?
Can I respond to that? Because another hat I wear, until recently, I was the chief diversity officer of my school, and so I did, following this whole DEI thing. And I think the reality is, let's not forget, corporations exist to make money. And if supporting a particular cause, including democracy or queer organizations or whatever it is, they won't until it serves their purpose. And we see that in my community, where with just the Pride events last June, suddenly, just a year ago, everyone was lining to have their logos in all the Pride floats and what. And then just like that, it changed. And nobody, even in the center, there was one corporation that said, listen, we're not going to take the money away, but please don't put our logo anywhere. Right? So there's still that risk again. And I think, not to say they can't. That being said, too, there are a lot of corporations that have stood up and still support DEI and still support underserved communities. But I suppose the question I always pose, even in my classes in general, like, whose job is it to provide, right? And ultimately, what kind of society do we as citizens want? Is it government? Is it us as individuals? Is it corporations? Right?
There's also, I think, if I can jump in, I'm so sorry. I think this corporate philanthropy is kind of a double-edged sword, unfortunately, because on the one hand, corporate funding can provide the resources and sometimes political cover for these organizations. But the organizations I talked to in Turkey were telling me they have a red list of corporations that they would never collaborate with, although these firms or companies are closer to the government. So working with them actually would provide more legitimacy for them to get out of the radar of the state. So I think it tells us kind of this to think they need to constantly calculate their legitimacy across multiple audiences, not just the state, but public, donors, corporations even at some point. So again, it's very grim.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point about the delegitimization of nonprofit causes, right? I think it's and that affects corporate philanthropy, right? Because corporations are resource dependent, right? I mean, they need to have the goodwill of the public, to avoid boycotts, etc., or political retribution in many authoritarian contexts. And that leaves us with our friends in the independent foundations, right? Which still are very kind of like project focused and short term, and not really stepping up to take the risks that they can afford to take because they do not have these legitimate pressures. That's something that Thomas also alluded to. So that's kind of the conundrum that we are. So we need to talk to our friends more, right? Friends in the philanthropic field. All right. Okay, then just from conclusion, I think we're coming to a. We still have a few minutes, right? Okay, so given the scale of what's going on right now, federal funding, and I think it's something we touched on earlier too, there are lots of causes who urgently need philanthropic resources, right? International development, healthcare going forward. So it's going to be a big crunch. So the scale of the federal retreat, or however you want to call it, is tremendous at this moment. And like the house is burning like in every room, basically. So the question here is, what are the chances of a return to any form of normalcy or hope once there is a change in administration? And it depends on what the next administration is going to be, right?
The damage will have been done. The damage is already done in what, 7 to 8 months, and just not in the US, internationally as well. Sadly, it'll be a very different reality after this administration. And you're right, Stefan, it depends on which party, or it doesn't matter, right? And not just the US, what happens globally with this tug of war between populism and democracy, or whatever you want to call it. It'll be different. But that said, though, this is enticing with a lot of the work of Thomas around, really working towards, to me, a liberal democracy, right? And what does that mean? And we all need to do that. And I think, yes, nonprofits and philanthropy have a big role, but ultimately it's about the citizens. But then again, that's where nonprofits come in, right? And that's where a sector comes to educate folks and to mobilize, frankly, right? But I don't want to sound so negative, but the damage is already done. And I think to pick up on this whole, really looking at scenarios, what are the likely scenarios moving forward, not in the US as well, globally?
If I could kind of add on to, I completely agree. The damage is done. One of the most memorable things I've heard this year was I was attending a webinar put on by the Rabin Group, which is kind of a DC-based lobbying and public relations firm. But they had Terrence Woodbury, who's at a Hit Strategies, a polling firm, was reflecting toward the end of this discussion. And he said, in the focus groups I've been listening to recently people across kind of political persuasions, in my head, I'm hearing about 3 worlds. World 1 is whatever came before Trump. That world has disappeared. Nobody is interested in talking about that world. It's gone. World 2 is whatever's happening right now. Some people are fighting against it. Some people like it. But everyone sees this as a transitional time. World 3 is whatever comes after. And that's what everyone is most excited to hear about. I was doing a strategy session with a coalition I work for this morning, and I really challenging them to be like, we've got to have a World 3 vision. We can't just be going and saying, oh, just increase funding of the existing funding streams. And it's like nobody, even people who are on our side on the issue, don't want to hear that. Like, we've got to have that World 3 vision.
And I think it ties to the broader question that I get asked all the time, how do I remain hopeful during these very dark times? And honestly, what gave me hope was what happened to me during my field work, was talking to these NGO, civil society actors, activists. And I thought to myself, if they are not giving up, while they are the ones being scrutinized, I shouldn't lose hope as well. So although like in Turkey, they were saying we feel like our conditions are worse than China nowadays, they still talked about adapting, resilience, building alliances, and protecting their local communities. So I think hope comes from that sort of sense of agency that they had, the belief that even under the close watch of the government, you can still shape some of the outcomes, or you can still shape the, I don't know, environment or the space you are in. So I think if they can hold on to the hope in these contexts, I think we can do that too. And I think US isn't there yet, although I'm not a US expert. So you are in the road to become, maybe, but let's not lose hope this early, I would say.
And I think that's an upbeat enough notion to end the afternoon on, right? So what else can we add to send people home happy into the weekend? All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the panelists for great presentations. Looking forward to seeing your papers for NPF. Again, we have covered these issues before, and looking forward to see more coverage of it in the journal.
Thank you, Stefan, and panelists. Obviously, there's a lot of nonprofit leaders, foundation leaders trying to stand up for nonprofits in this difficult time. And it's also, I think, important to note that researchers are trying to capture, as we've heard, some of what's going on. There's also another effort I just want to mention that Chris Einhoff is trying to help coordinate of researchers around the country and maybe even around the world who are looking at what nonprofits are doing in these difficult times, and more material on that in the follow-up that we will be sending you, which will include in a follow-up email on upcoming events and content from ARNOVA and Independent Sector and Nonprofit Policy Forum, and you'll look in a little while for a summary of the symposium. Please take a few minutes afterwards to fill out a survey on the symposium. We are trying to do better each year, and you'll get a survey link in the chat. And that's our program for today. Thank you for your commitment to the charitable sector. We know it's a challenging time, but we hope you go into this weekend energized and excited. Thank you.